Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight, we are going to spend a long, slow evening with a young woman named Beatrice of Provence, who was born the fourth daughter of a southern French lord in the middle years of the 13th century, and who lived a life full enough to fill a chronicle 3 times its length. She was the youngest of 4 sisters, and each of her sisters married a king, and she herself ended a crowned queen in a foreign realm in the south of Italy. We will follow her from her cradle in the ochre stone of Aix to a hill town called Nocera at the end of her days. There will be a wedding, an eastern voyage, a captivity, a winter march over the Alps, and a coronation. It is a long story, and a good one for sleeping through. If you find that you enjoy chronicles of the medieval world told slowly for the ends of your evening, please do consider tapping subscribe below. That gesture is what allows me to keep making stories of this length, this slowness. Turn on the bell as well, if you like, and you will hear when the next chronicle arrives. Thank you kindly for being here. We can begin. Picture this. There is a market borough in the south of France called Aix. It sits in a wide bowl of low ridges, held on one side by the grey line of the Alpilles and on the other by the round shoulder of Mount Sainte-Victoire, which changes colour with the hour and goes rose at the close of day. The borough is built out of ochre stone, warm to the touch, and the walls of the houses drink in the sun of the south for the whole length of summer and give it back through the evenings. In hot months, the streets smell of dust and of bread. In cold months, they smell of wood smoke and of the almond kindling that the bakers use because it burns clean. The wind that comes down from the north is dry and cold and is called the mistral. And when it drops, the settlement falls still, and you can hear a child crying 2 streets away, and the fountain in the market square running over its stone lip. In the earlier 1230s, or perhaps a 12-month after that, an apartment in the comital residence at Aix was made ready for a birth. The seat of the rulers of that region was not one of those enormous castles that came later. It was a comital residence in a walled quarter of the borough, with a courtyard of pale tile, a fountain in the courtyard, and a low range of upper apartments above the courtyard where the family lived. There was a chapel at one end and a house for eating at the other, and between them ran a corridor that was always cool because it faced away from the sun. The birthing space was towards the back, where the household could keep it quiet, and where the linen and the warmed water and the midwife's stool could be brought in without walking through the public halls. The mistress of the residence was a lady of Savoy, and she carried the same style the child would carry. She was mother of 3 girls already, which was a fact the household spoke of gently, without complaint, because she loved them and would not have them think themselves less for lacking a brother. The eldest, Margaret, was 10 that season and was clever and quiet. The second, Eleanor, was 7 and proud and dark of hair. The third, Sancerre, was 5 and was the softest of them, and would sit on her mother's foot for the pleasure of being carried a few steps that way. Now a 4th was coming. The household prepared for another girl, because the pattern seemed to be the pattern of the residence, and if a son came, they would be surprised. The ruler of that southern county in those seasons was Ramon Berenguer. He was the 5th of his line, though the chroniclers of that country sometimes numbered him differently and called him the 4th. He was a man of medium height, with a beard cut close, a soldier's shoulders, and a habit of quiet in the presence of women. He liked his wife very much, and he liked his daughters. And he was known to hold the smallest of them up to the window to show her the mountain when the light on it was worth seeing. He had come into the county at an early age, and he had spent his youth setting his affairs in order, settling the boroughs that had grown restless, defending the borders against Toulouse, keeping the peace with the emperor whose lands lay east across the Rhone. He was not a man who wasted words. His clerks noted of him that he read every parchment he signed, and that he asked measured questions afterwards. The child was born in that hushed apartment with the mistral just falling. The bells of Aix rang 3 times for a daughter, which was the custom of the borough, and the father came in and paused a while at the door before he came near. The mother held the babe at her shoulder and murmured the style they had chosen. Beatrice after her mother, so that this new one would carry the Savoyard style into the next generation of the household. Her father did not speak for a moment. Then he murmured it back quietly and touched her on the top of the head with 2 fingers, which was his way with all his girls, and he went out again to let the women do their work. Outside in the courtyard, the tile was warm from the day. The fountain ran. A steward crossed on some errand, saw the ruler's face, and understood that all was well. The kitchens were told to send up a warm broth. The chapel was told to say a mass at the first hour in the morning. A messenger was chosen to ride north to the Savoyard uncles with the news, and another to ride to the households of the elder girls, who were not yet gone from the family, but had begun to travel a little, on visits to their mother's kin. The borough below the walls of the comital residence went about its evening. The bakers pulled the last bread from the ovens. The smiths raked their fires down for the night. The dogs of the streets settled into their places by the doors. The infant slept. She slept as newborns sleep, in a wooden cradle rocked by her mother's foot, and while she slept, the sun went slowly off the ochre walls of Aix, and the light in the courtyard turned rose and then blue and then dark. Her father, who was not usually a man who lingered in nurseries, came back after supper and sat a while by the cradle. He did not do it because he thought the babe needed him. He did it because he liked the space and the quiet, and because the news of another girl had a weight to it that he wanted to sit with. It meant, he thought, that the line of Berenguer would go on for another generation through the women. It meant a set of alliances yet to be arranged. It meant that the county he had spent his life setting in order would pass through the hand of one of these girls. Though he did not yet know which one, he did not resent this. He was a careful ruler, and the careful part of him understood that girls, if they were guarded well and married well, could reach further than sons. His own wife's kin had taught him that. The Savoyards had many. The Savoyards were everywhere. He touched the cradle once lightly. He said her chosen style a second time, aloud in the hush, so that the walls would hold it, and then he went to bed. The nurse in the corner took over the rocking. The mother slept a little way off in the wide bed. The chapel bell rang midnight, which in Aix in the 13th century was not the middle of the night, as we reckon it now, but only a signal, a silver sound in the quiet. A way of saying that another day was over and had been good enough. The infant slept, the borough slept, her first day was done. And the story of her life, which would carry her out of that apartment and across the sea, to a Cypriot vineyard, and to a tent on the Nile, and to a stone chamber in Rome, and to a Norman keep on the Bay of Naples, and to a linen-covered bed in a hill borough called Nocera, began quietly, with a fountain running in a courtyard, and a fourth-born asleep in a rocked cradle, and a father sitting on a stool by the wall, watching her. They shared a nursery, the sisters, when the youngest was a babe enough to sleep in the trundle rather than in the wide bed. Their nursery was on the courtyard side of the residence, so that the morning sun came in through the 2 narrow openings and lay in golden stripes across the tiled floor. There was a wide bed for the 3 older siblings, in which they slept, crosswise sometimes, and Sancha's foot always somehow up by Margaret's ear, and Eleanor complaining in her sleep about being pushed. There was a nursery cot for the smallest by the wall, and above it, a shelf on which stood a row of painted saints, and a wooden horse that had been Margaret's when she was a toddler, and that had come down through all of them. The girls of a comital residence in the south in that century did not have the small rooms of their own that a modern child expects. They kept to the one shared quarter for a lengthy stretch. They dressed there, and were washed there, and were combed there, and were sung to there by whichever nurse was on duty. Their clothes hung on wooden pegs along one wall in an ordered row from largest to smallest, so that the biggest gowns hung at the head of the wall, and Eleanor's next, and then Sanchia's. And then the very plain wool dresses that had begun with Margaret, and been handed down and washed and turned, and mended, and were now, at last, on the youngest. Margaret, 10, was the leader. Not because anyone had told her to be, but because she was the firstborn and had a settled way of talking that the younger ones listened to. She was tall for her age, and her hair was a warm brown that went honey in the sun. She had a mole on her cheekbone that gave her a serious look even when she smiled. She could read Latin a little, taught by the chaplain, and she read aloud to the others in the afternoons. Sitting on the floor with the book on her knees, while the 3 others lay across the bed and drew pictures on wax tablets with the point of a bone stylus. What she read was not always suitable, because she liked the Psalter's storms and lamentations. But the smaller ones did not mind, because her voice was clear and made anything sound orderly. Eleanor at 7 was the proud one. She had dark hair, almost black, and she wore it braided down her back with a strip of blue linen. She had, even at 7, a way of holding her head that suggested she thought well of herself. She was not unkind. She was only aware that she was the second, and that the second daughter of a ruler could reasonably expect to marry a man of consequence, and she had begun to imagine this without knowing what she was imagining. She would linger at the window sometimes and watch the horses in the courtyard, and murmur half to herself that she would one day live in a house with a good many horses. The nurse would laugh gently and tell her that a countess had horses if she was patient. Eleanor would nod, satisfied, and go back to the bed to lie on her stomach and turn the pages of her elder sister's book. Sanchia at 5 was the sweet one. Her hair was the lightest of the 4, almost pale gold, and her eyes were a softened grey. She cried more easily than her sisters, but she also laughed more easily. And she had a habit of putting her small hand into someone's larger hand for the pleasure of it, as if to check that the person was still there. She loved her mother more than any of the sisters did, and would climb into her mother's lap at the least invitation, and would sit for as long as she was allowed. The nurses noticed that Sanchia was the one who needed the most tending, and they gave it because she asked so little of it in words that it was easy to give. The youngest at first was only a warm weight in the trundle bed. She grew into her siblings' shape as tender children do, watching them without knowing she was watching. She learned her siblings' styles before she learned other words. She murmured, "Margaret first," or something like Margaret, a syllable that could have been anything but that Margaret chose to hear as her own, and she picked the baby up and carried her around the room to celebrate. She murmured, "Eleanor next," or a piece of Eleanor, and Eleanor was proud and told her mother about it. Sanchia she did not say for many months, because that one was too gentle in the mouth. When she did say it at last, Sanchia clapped her hands and cried. And the 2 of them sat together on the floor for a whole afternoon while the older 2 were at their lessons, playing a game with pebbles that had no rules. The nursery of a comital residence was run by 2 nurses and a chamberwoman. The nurses were southern women, one from Aix itself and one from a village near Tarascon. They spoke the Languedoc among themselves and to their charges, and taught them songs of the South Plain sweet tunes about a cricket in the vines, about a boat on the pond at Arles, about the goat-herd's dog that would not come home. The chamberwoman was older, and had been in the household since, before the eldest was born. She was the one who kept the girls' clothes in order, who mended the tears, who counted the silver spoons at the end of each week, and who could tell, by the sound of a foot in the corridor, which of the daughters was coming, and whether they had been crying. Their mother came to the nursery every day, at least once, and often twice. She had many other duties, because the countess of that southern county ran a household of some size. But she made a point of coming into her daughter's quarter in the middle of the morning and in the last hour of the afternoon. She would sit on the wide bed and open a book on her knee, sometimes a book of hours, and sometimes a slim volume of French tales, and she would read to them in her calm voice, and her charges would leave whatever they were doing to gather around her. Sanchia would climb up, the youngest would come and lean on her mother's leg. Eleanor would sit at the foot of the bed with her hands folded. The eldest, being of that station, would sit properly at her mother's side, following the words with her own finger on the page. When their mother read them Latin, they did not always understand it, but they liked the sound of it. And they liked the way she stopped from time to time to explain a word. They shared a father who did not come often into the nursery. He was not distant, exactly. He was simply a ruler in a household of rulers, and he had his own errands to keep. But once or twice a week, he would come in with some news, or with a small gift he had thought of on a ride, or only to pause in the doorway and count them with his eyes to see that they were all there. He would call each one by title, in birth order: Margaret, Eleanor, Sanchia, Beatrice, and each would answer, and then he would go. It was a brief ritual, and none of the girls remembered later whether it had been every day or only some days. But they remembered the sound of those spoken words and the order of them for the rest of their lives. That was the pattern of them. The sisters together in one warm nursery, one reading, one imagining a house of horses, one climbing up onto a mother's lap, one warm weight in a trundle bed. What their futures would look like was not yet visible. It would not have been visible to anyone. But the group of them were, in that shared bedroom, a set of a certain kind, a tidy nursery of alliances waiting to be made, a household of girls that a careful father would soon send out into the courts of Christendom. The Lady of Savoy was 30 when her fourth girl was born, and she had held the county at her husband's side for well over a decade. She had come south to marry Ramon Berenguer when she was scarce more than a lass herself, and she had made the trek from the Savoyard mountains over the Alps and down the Rhone in a train of mules and men-at-arms and cousins, and she had never gone back to live. She had gone back to visit, more than once, when her father was ill or when a brother was married. But her life, from the day she came into Aix as a bride, had been the life of a Provençal matron. Her mind, however, was still a Savoyard mind. That was the thing everyone said of her. She thought like her father's daughter, carefully with an eye to alliances, with a habit of counting the reach of a family across the great courts of Christendom. Her brothers were scattered, and she kept in her memory a clear picture of where each of them was and what each of them was doing. Amadeus, the eldest, held the mountain country in Savoy itself, and would be count there when their father died. Peter, the second, was the ambitious one, and had begun to make his way in England at the court of Henry III, where his gifts had been noticed, and where he was beginning to gather offices. Boniface the third was in the church, and would rise very high in it, though at this time he was only a young bishop looking towards greater things. William was there too, and Thomas, and there was a sister, Margaret, married into Burgundy. It was a large brotherhood, and the Countess of Provence kept letters going out to them all, in her own script or by a chaplain scribe when she was busy with the girls. The writing table where she did this work was placed by the window in her private quarters, on the upper floor of the comital residence, where the light was best. It was a plain oak surface with 3 drawers, and on it stood always the same things: a tiny silver inkwell, shaped like an acorn, a jar of iron gall ink, a bundle of quills cut and ready, a wax tablet for drafts, a stack of parchment sheets, a modest horn cup for sand to blot with, and a shallow dish of red sealing wax, and a signet with the Savoyard cross on it. The private space smelled of ink, and of a wisp of smoke from the narrow chimney, and of a bowl of dried lavender that a servant refreshed every week. There was a chapel screen at the far end, made of carved wood, painted red and gold, behind which was a tiny altar with a wooden crucifix and a book of hours. She would go behind the screen twice a day to say her prayers, and then she would come out again to pen her correspondence, and to think. She was a religious woman. That was not unusual in her age. What was unusual, or a bit unusual, was that her religion had a practical shape. She gave to the orders of the friars, both Dominican and Franciscan. And she gave in a way that expected a certain kind of return sermons in the boroughs where the count needed loyalty, prayers at chosen altars for named kin, the education of poor boys who might come into his service later. She kept accounts, and she kept them well. Her clerks trusted her figures more than they trusted his, though they voiced this quietly among themselves and never in front of him. Her learning was, for a woman of her rank in that century, considerable. She had Latin fluently and could compose a note in it when a churchman required one. She followed the Languedoc without effort, and the northern French, and could speak the Piedmontese of her childhood when a mountain merchant came into the residence. She had a private library, not the vast collection of a king, but a shelf of about 20 books, which for a woman of her sort was a considerable trove to own. There were psalters and books of hours, and there was a life of St. Louis, of that Provençal port, and a chronicle of the Savoyard house, and a book of the poems of Bernard de Ventadorn that had been given her by a troubadour who had spent a winter at Aix, and a manual on the government of a household that she had asked her brother Peter to send from England. She turned a leaf every day in the last light of the afternoon, sitting in a chair by the opening with a footstool for her feet. Her girls watched her do this. That is one of the ways the mind of a matron passes into the mind of a child, not by lecture, but by the daily sight of a woman with a book. Margaret learned Latin from watching her at her Latin. Eleanor learned to hold her head over a page in the same slight tilt she used. Sanchia learned that quiet was a thing the older woman did on purpose. Beatrice, the youngest, learned all of these. Watching from her nursery seat when she was very small, and later from the low stool by the table where her elder would set her when she was old enough to sit up. Their mother taught them too, but not always by direct instruction. She would take one of them aside, sometimes when a letter had come from a Savoyard uncle, and she would show them the seal and read a passage aloud and explain who the uncle was and what he was doing, and where his court lay, and what news he wanted. This was, though the daughters did not know it at the time, a slow lesson in the great geography of a Christendom that spread from the Alps to England to Rome. She was teaching them the map of their kin. She was teaching them to think of the world as a set of courts at which one had, or one might have, a place. She was not, in the ordinary sense, an ambitious woman. What she was, instead, was orderly. She saw that her husband had the sisters, and she saw that if they were well raised, they would go out into the world as the Savoyards had done, and would carry the reach of the line of Berenguer, along with the reach of Savoy, into places where a good deal could be arranged. She did not think of them as instruments. She loved them. She loved Margaret's clever quiet, and Eleanor's proud straight back, and Sanchia's soft warm hand, and the murmuring shape of the youngest at her elbow. But she raised them all with a certain clearness about what girls of her rank were for. They were for the next generation, and for the next joining of two families into three, and for the long, slow work of keeping Christendom held together by marriages instead of wars. She would sit at her writing table in the late afternoon, then with a letter half written to a brother in England or a cousin in Burgundy, and she would hear the sound of the nursery through the floor. A laugh, a modest argument, a nurse's soothing tone, and she would smile a little to herself, and dip her quill, and go on. Her husband, coming in from the courtyard at that hour, would sometimes look up and see her light in the window, and would think, without murmuring it, that he had married the right woman. The chapel bell rang the hour. The dry lavender in its bowl gave off its scent. The Savoyard mind of a matron of that southern court went on with its work. The world outside the comital residence in Aix was one of the most cultivated in Christendom. That is not a claim that Aix put upon itself. It was simply the truth of the region. The South in the middle of the 13th century still lived inside the lingering afterglow of the troubadour age. The named voices of that art, Bernat de Ventadorn, Pere Vidal, Rambaut de Vaqueras, had been dead for a generation or two, but their songs still travelled the highways. Their followers, less brilliant but still skilled, still came into the chambers of the comital seat and sang on feast days, and in the ordinary weeks between them. Poetry in the Languedoc filled the air of the great room, the way wood smoke filled it in the cold season. The Languedoc was the language of the south, and it was distinct from the Languedoil of the north. It was the language in which people said "oc" for yes, rather than the northern oil, and it was the tongue of Provence and of Languedoc and of the counts of Toulouse and of the vast cities of Marseille and Arles and Montpellier. It was softer than the northern French. It had more open vowels. It sat well with music. The troubadours had chosen it not by accident, but because it sang. It was the language of her cradle, and though she would learn the northern French later and Latin from her elder, and would come in her life to speak also the Italian of the Sicilian court, it was the Languedoc she thought in as a young child, and it was in that tongue that the songs of her earliest seasons were sung. The instruments of the comital residents were not many, but they were well chosen. There was a harp of the kind that a travelling poet could carry on a mule, with strings of gut and a soundboard of thin cedar. There was a viol, which was a bowed instrument, something like a fiddle, and which could carry a sustained line under a singer's voice. There was a lute, less common in that period, but seen occasionally when a Spanish player came up from Aragon. There was a drum, a tambour, that a boy could beat with one hand. On feast days, when the ruler wished to make a show of his household, all of these might be heard together in the chamber. On ordinary evenings, a single harp was usually enough, and a single voice, and the crowd around a low table would fall quiet to hear. The subjects of the poems the troubadours sang were, in that age, mostly love. A troubadour's craft was the craft of praising a lady, of praising her from a distance, of turning her name into a polished stone that the poet could put into every line. This was often not a real lady, but a lady of the poet's mind, an idea of a lady around whom he arranged his verses. Beatrice, as a young child, listened to many such songs without knowing that this is what they were. She heard a poet in her father's chamber sing about a countess with a white throat and a hand like a lily, and she understood without being told that a countess was a fine thing to be. She heard another sing about the pain of being far from the lady of one's thought, and she understood, without being told, that love was a matter for grown people, and that it hurt them, and that they liked to sing about the hurt. But the poems were not only about love. There were also sirventes, which were poems of moral commentary, of the sort in which a troubadour might scold a lord for cowardice or praise another for generosity. There were tensos, which were mock debates between two poets on some point of the heart or of manners, and there were, now and again, poems of the fields and the highways, pastoral pieces in which a poet met a shepherdess in a wood, or a poem in which the arrival of springtime was celebrated with a list of the flowers that had appeared. These last were the ones the girls of the Count's house liked best, because they were sung slowly and their pictures were easy to see. Outside the walls, the county spread out around Aix in a shape that was already ancient. The ways of the Romans still lay under the soil, and often still ran on the surface. The Via Aurelia went east from Aix towards Italy, and the routes north went towards Avignon and the Rhône. The way to Arles was busy with traffic that carried grain out and cloth in. And the highway to the coast was the route along which the sea came to Aix, in the form of salted fish, and jars of olive oil pressed by the shore, and the news of ships that had come in from Genoa or Barcelona. The land between the towns was olive ground and vine ground. The Provençal olive tree, with its silver underneath leaf and its low crooked trunk, held the hillsides in long ordered lines, planted more centuries ago than anyone could number. The vines lay in the flatter ground, on the plain around Arles and along the river valleys. There were almond trees, which flowered white in February and made a thin snow along the route at that time of year. There were fields of wheat and barley in the wider valleys. There were sheep on the higher ground, kept by shepherds, who moved them up in summer to the Alpes and down again in winter to the plain, a practice already called transhumance in that century, and still called that now. The boroughs were plain by the standards of a later age, but large by the standards of their own. Aix itself was not the largest of them. The coastal port was larger. Arles was larger still. Having been a Roman capital, and keeping some of its old works, the amphitheatre stood, the theatre stood in part, the walls stood almost whole. Avignon, on the other side of the Rhône, and not strictly in the county, was a settlement of pilgrims and traders, and would soon be much more. Tarascon, on the Rhône below Avignon, had its low stone fortress by the river's edge, where the rulers liked to stay when they moved. Brignoles, inland, was a favourite hunting seat. Forcalquier, up in the Alps of the Highlands, had been a separate county in the old days, and had been joined in by marriage a generation before. The yearly round of feasts and hunts turned the family through these seats, in a way that was as measured as the seasons. Cold months tended to be at Aix, because Aix was the ruler's chief seat and had the largest household and the best warmth. Spring might be at Tarascon or Brignoles. Summer, if the ruler could get away from his cases and his letters, was often a season of moving from one hunting lodge to another, following the game and the weather. The daughters did not always travel with him at first. The youngest, being so tender, stayed with her mother and her siblings at Aix through most of her first years, but they came to know the other seats as visits, and later, as seats of their own. It was inside this world that the child grew up. The palette she took into her mind, before she learned to name any of it, was one of ochre stone and cicada song, of harp and viol, of almond flower in February and cicada in June, of the horse's hoof on the paved highway going east, of the smell of new bread in the morning, of the poet's measured phrases in the Languedoc, going out over a house full of shining eyes and low voices. It was a country. It was hers by birth, and whatever else her life would come to be, however far she would travel, she would carry it with her. Ramon Berenguer ran his court out of a plain audience chamber on the ground floor of the residence at Aix, opening on the courtyard where the fountain ran. The chamber was long and low, with a beamed ceiling and one wide opening, with wooden shutters that were pulled back in the morning to let in the light. There was a stone bench along one wall for those who waited to be heard, and a plain oak table across the far end, with 2 chairs behind it, one for the Count and one, when necessary, for his Chancellor. The Chancellor was a man called Romy de Villeneuve, a knight of steady service and of clear judgment, who had served the master for many years, and who, more than once in his lord's absence, ran the county with a firm hand. The Count sat behind that table for a good part of every day when he was at Aix. Petitioners came in, a merchant of the seaport, complaining that his goods had been seized by a rival at a fair, a peasant of the Alpes, complaining that his lord had raised his dues past the old custom, a bishop's clerk asking that a boundary be redrawn between 2 abbeys' lands. He listened. He read what the Chancellor put before him. He asked questions, measured and careful ones, of the men in front of him. He made his rulings in a voice that was quieter than the case usually warranted. Then the men bowed and went out, and the next were brought in, and the day went on. He kept a chancery, which is to say a small office of clerks, who penned his correspondence and copied his charters. A handful of men at any one time, working at a bench in a room next to the audience chamber, with quills and parchment and a box of unbleached wax for seals. Every charter he issued was sealed with his own seal. A horseman in armour on one side, and the arms of Provence on the other, and every note that went out was signed by his own palm. He believed in signing what went out of his house. He was fastidious about that. He was also, in that decade, a man at war. Not a vast war. The southern rulers in that century did not fight vast wars, because they did not have the men. He fought the boroughs, the coastal port, most of all. A proud sea city that would rather have been a republic than a fief, and that flared into revolt from time to time. Arles, which had ambitions of its own. Nice, on the far side of the county, closer to Genoa than to Aix. He fought these settlements, not in pitched battles, but in grinding squeezings, in sieges, in the interruption of trade, in the placing of loyal men in their governments. He would ride out with a mounted force for a week or two, put pressure on a wall, take a delegation of the borough's elders back to Aix, and settle the matter with a treaty that they would grumble about for a 12-month, and then, more or less, keep. His hair had gone grey at the temples by the seasons. His youngest was old enough to notice him. His beard, which he had kept close-cropped in his earlier years, had grown a little fuller. His hands were roughened, not by farm work, but by riding and the reins and the hilt of a sword. He had the eyes of a man who spent his hours out of doors and who had learned to squint against a hard sun. When he came in from the country in the evening, the smell of horse and dust came in with him, and he would stop at the fountain in the courtyard and rinse his face before he went into his private quarters, and the water on his beard would catch the last light. He was, above all, a father who arranged the futures of his girls. That is not a hard thing to state now, but it was the vast labour of his last decade, and it was a labour he took with the same care that he took his charters. He believed that his girls must go into families of at least his own standing. He believed that a bride's marriage was a matter of a ruler's honour as much as of the young woman's own. He also believed, though he would not have used the word, in his children's happiness. He would not, he had once told his wife over supper, we'd a girl to a man he had not himself looked in the eye. He had 4 to place. It was going to be a measured business. He began with Margaret. She was of an age to be considered when he began to think of it, and he thought of it for a stretch before he acted. There were suitors to be considered from Aragon and Toulouse and Castile, all of them respectable, none of them, in his view, the right man. Then, in the spring of that season, a note came from the north, from the court of the young King of France. Louis IX, still a boy himself, but already ruling under the grip of his own dam, the Queen Blanche of Castile. The parchment asked, in the careful language of a royal chancery, about the firstborn of the southern ruler's girls. He looked over it twice, put it down, and did not answer for a week. He talked to the Countess, he talked to Romy de Villeneuve. He penned at last a message of his own, careful in its turn, and over the next months his firstborn was arranged into being a queen up north. She left the south in the summer of that season, in a train of horses and covered carts, with her dowager's chamberwoman travelling with her, and with a retinue of Provençal knights who would settle her into her new house and then come home. She was 13. She was the first of the sisters to go. The youngest, if she was born yet, was very tender, a babe in arms or a toddler in the courtyard, and she would not have understood that her elder was going away for good. She would have understood only that the mole on that eldest cheekbone and the clear-reading voice were suddenly not in the nursery anymore, and that the wide bed had one less body in it, and that the nurse cried a bit in the corner. He made a second match a few seasons later. Eleanor, at that age, was matched to Henry III of England, the young king across the water, whose court was already the one in which the Savoyard uncles were making their careers. This was even more of a coup for the line of Berenguer than the first match had been. 2 of his girls queens in the vast realms of Latin Christendom. The chroniclers of the day began to write about the rulers of that southern county in a different way, as if the family had suddenly become of a different order. He himself, so it was told, had shrugged when someone congratulated him, and remarked only that he had done his duty. But his wife smiled in a way that meant she was proud. Eleanor went north in her turn in the summer of the late 1330s. Her going was quieter than Margaret's, partly because the household had done it before and knew how, and partly because Eleanor herself, being a proud child, wanted to leave without weeping. She waited in the courtyard of the residence, in a travelling gown of dark blue, and let her mother arrange the veil, and stepped up onto the mounting block, and rode out through the gate without looking back. That was Eleanor. She had been imagining a house with many horses, and she was going now to England, and there would be many horses. By the seasons, the youngest was 3 or 4. The wide bed in the nursery held only Sanchia. The 3 older ones had been thinned to 1. That elder was 13 or 14, and was quiet and sweet, and was the one whose match had not yet been arranged. The girls' quarter felt suddenly larger, and the 2 shared its end together, and their father would come to the doorway sometimes, and count the 2 he had left and go away again with a slower step. The household thinned as the older girls went out. His beard was greyer than it had been. The Chancellor Romy de Villeneuve was greyer too. Life in the south went on. The seasons went by. Her turn would come. The Cornish one was eventually matched to Richard of Cornwall, the brother of the English king, and would go north too, but for a while the 2 youngest had each other, the last of them, in a chamber half emptied of its elder kin. And their father, riding back to Aix on a summer evening in the mid-40s, dust on his boots and the day's letters in his saddlebag, would sometimes think of the youngest daughter, who was now his only child at hand, the 4th of them, and would find himself thinking that he had not yet begun to arrange her. She was tender yet. She was not urgent yet, but she was, though he did not know it, going to be the one who mattered most. Ramon Berenguer took ill in the summer of the 45th season of that century, and he did not recover. He was not an old ruler by our reckoning. He was in his mid-40s, perhaps closer to 50. But he had lived a life that used a man up, and the disease that came for him came fast. It began, the household told, with a fever that did not break. He came in from a ride with a certain stiffness in his shoulder, and by the 2nd day of it he was in his chamber, and did not come out. The Chancellor, Romy de Villeneuve, took over the audience chamber. The physicians of Aix were sent for. A messenger went to the coastal port for a Genoese doctor who was known to be good, and another went north to Avignon. His wife sat by his bed and did not sleep. The sick-bed apartment in the residence at Aix was not a grand setting. It was a plain space on the upper floor, with a wide bed of dark wood and a slender chimney, and one opening looking east. The bed had been made up with clean linen, and his own coverlet, which was of red wool, worked with a border of vines. The window was left open a little for the air, because the physicians thought the air should move. There was a stool by the bed for whoever was watching, and a low table on which stood a jar of water and a cup and a silver basin. A chaplain came in and out. A bishop came from the cathedral in the afternoons. The countess did not leave, except to sleep an hour on a pallet at the foot of the bed. She was 11 of age that summer. She was old enough to understand that her father was dying, and old enough to feel the household bending around the knowledge. But she was still very young. And the grown women of the residence kept her out of the sick chamber for most of the days. She was allowed in briefly at first light, to sit on the edge of the wide bed and take her father's palm, and to murmur the quiet phrases the countess had told her to use. Her father was thin by then, and his beard had grown untended over the fortnight, and his eyes moved at a measured pace. He would look at her and try to smile. He would lay his other hand on her hair for a familiar gesture from her earliest years, though she did not think of it that way, and he would murmur her Christian name. Then the countess would lift her down and take her to the door, and the chaplain would come back in. He died in the last week of August. The bell of the Cathedral of Aix tolled slowly for him over the tiled roofs of the borough, and the bells of the smaller churches picked it up. And by evening, every parish of the county had heard that Ramon Berenguer was dead. The household went into mourning. Black cloth was hung across the doors. The mirrors and the silver were covered. The countess dressed her daughter and herself in dark wool, and did not weep in the daughter's presence, though she wept at night. He was laid out in the vast chamber, on a bier draped with a red pall, with a candle at his head and a candle at his feet. And the leading men of the county came in one by one, and knelt and prayed, and went out. The Cornish one, by that season, was already gone north across the water, to her marriage to Richard of Cornwall. The message of the ruler's death was sent to her, and to the eldest in France, and to the English Queen at Westminster. But the elder daughters could not come. It was too far. Their households had other duties. They sent messengers back with notes of grief and with promises of masses. He was buried in the Cathedral of Aix, in a stone tomb at the side of the choir, with the bishop saying the Mass and the whole nave crowded to the doors with the burghers of the settlement he had ruled for 30 winters. Then the will was read. This was done on the 3rd day after the burial, in the audience chamber, with a fair measure of formality. Romy de Villeneuve took his place behind the comital table, in his mourning gown, and had his testament on the wood in front of him. The countess sat to one side, in a chair with a black cushion. Her youngest sat by her, in a plain chair, in the same dark wool she had been wearing since her father's death. The chief men of Provence, the bishops, the chief lords, the chancellors of the boroughs, and the count's own household officers, stood in a half-circle in front of the table. The doors were closed. A clerk unrolled the parchment. The document did what nobody had expected it to do. It gave the whole county, not part, not a marriage portion, but the whole thing, from Nice to the Rhone, from the Alps to the sea, to his last born. The elder girls were passed over. They had, the will noted, been given. The eldest had gone north with a dower, the next to England with another, and the softest had gone with a third. They were queens, or the wives of leading men, and they had no need of the southern county. It was to go to the child in Aix. The reading of that clause went into the hall like a stone dropped into a still pond. The lords in the chamber did not move. Romy de Villeneuve read on in his careful voice. Through the lesser clauses, the endowments for churches, the pensions for old servants, the arrangements for the countess's dower. But the chief announcement had been made. There was a child of 11 sitting by her dowager in dark wool, with her palms folded in her lap, and she was, at that instant, the greatest heiress in the Mediterranean south. She did not understand it at once. She understood that people were looking at her, and she did not know why they were looking at her. She looked up at her elder. The dowager looked back at her calmly and did not say anything. Later, in the private quarters, with the door closed and the servants sent out, the older woman would explain what the parchment had said and what it meant. She would tell her that she was, from that day forward, countess of that southern county in her own right, though the widow would rule in her stead while she was still a babe. She would tell her that men would soon come to Aix to want to marry her. She would tell her, very gently, that her 3 elder siblings would not be pleased. That last piece was the truth. In Paris, when the news reached her, the eldest was furious. She had been born the first. She had believed, in the ordinary way of French royal wives, that some real share of the southern county was hers by right, or at least her son's by right. Or at least in the natural course of things, something owed to a Queen of France. To find herself passed over entirely for the little sister she remembered as a baby in a trundle bed was a wound she did not forgive. Eleanor, in London, took it less hotly. She was more like her father in that way, and she felt the thing and put it aside, though she remembered it. Sanchia, in her English residence, wept a little and answered nothing. But the eldest wrote to her uncles in Savoy and to her husband Louis IX, and she began, from that first season, to make trouble about it. This quarrel would run for the next 2 decades. For the present, the chief matter was the child in X. The southern county had gone from being the concern of a careful old ruler to being a prize suddenly loose in the world, tied only to a lass of 11, whose dowager, however capable, was a widow. The suitors would come. The chief powers, the King of France, the King of Aragon, the Emperor Frederick II, the Count of Toulouse, would each begin to think about what to do. The county lay on the Rhone at the door of Italy, and it held one of the busy ports of the Western Sea, and it would go to the man who married her. The dowager, in her private quarters, with her daughter in her lap, knew all of this. She was not a woman who fooled herself about the world. She sat with her hand on her youngest's head and looked at the opening while the light went off the ochre wall of the courtyard. And she began, quietly, in her mind, to compose letters to her brothers. Beatrice of Savoy's brothers, when the widow set her pen to parchment, were already moving pieces on the wider board. Each was in a different corner of Christendom, and each had already, in the 20 seasons since she came south as a bride, made himself worth a message. She thought of them, in her mind, as if they were pillars set at the corners of a map, holding down the ground on her heiress's behalf. The Savoyards, as a family, had a habit that other great families of the age did not always have. They stuck together, they shared information, they pooled their resources. If Peter in England found himself in need of a loan, Amadeus in the mountains would send silver. If Boniface needed a benefice for a young cousin, William would find one in his own diocese. They did not always agree with each other on matters of great policy, but they agreed on the family's interest. And they were rare in that century in the way they moved as one, when it came to what belonged to the House of Savoy. Beatrice of Savoy had grown up in that habit, when she found herself widowed with a great heiress on her hands. She wrote at once to all 4 brothers, and she did not have to explain very much. The letters went out in the first weeks after the Count's death, carried in leather cases by riders who wore the Count's livery until they crossed the border into other lands and then changed into plain clothes for the safety of the route. One went north over the Alps to Amadeus. One went further on the ship route across the Channel to Peter in England. One went to Boniface, who was at that time on the way himself and had to be caught by a rider who knew where to look. One went to William, who was closer at hand and who was the first to reply. The mountain pass over which the letter to Amadeus travelled was the Mont Cenis. In September of 1245, when the message went, the pass was still open, though it would close later in the autumn. The rider went up the long trudging road out of Susa, with mules for his baggage and 2 servants for company, and he climbed for 2 days, and he crossed the pass in a wind that carried the first snow of the 12th. And he came down the other side into Savoyard country, and stopped at an alpine lodging to warm himself before he went on. The alpine lodging was one of many that the Counts of Savoy kept. A stone building with a low fire in the middle, a bench along the wall, a woman who kept it with her son. He gave the woman a coin, and she gave him a bowl of soup, and he warmed himself. And he went on the next morning. Amadeus, when he had read the letter, sat with it for some time, and then wrote back. His reply said, in effect, "I am with you. I will send men. I will send silver. Do not let the child be taken by anyone." The parchment came back across the pass a fortnight later, before the pass closed. And Beatrice of Savoy read it in her chamber at Aix, and put it in her writing table with the other letters, in the drawer where she kept the most important ones. Amadeus followed the note with an escort, a body of Savoyard knights who came south down the Rhone and settled themselves in Aix for the winter, unobtrusive but present. Peter's message came later because the sea route was heavy in the autumn. Peter was in London when the news reached him. He was, at that moment, one of the most powerful men at the English court. Though he was foreign-born and had come without a title of his own, he had made himself indispensable to the young king and had begun to gather English holdings and English offices. When he heard that his sibling was a widow and his niece, Beatrice, he did what came naturally to him. He penned at once to his brother Boniface and to his sibling in the south, and to another sibling married into Burgundy, and he began to arrange in his mind what the family should do. He was not a warm man in his correspondence. His pages were, like his mind, practical and short. He offered his sibling his help and his money, and he offered his niece his protection, and he asked what she wanted done. Boniface, when he got the news, was already in Rome, or near Rome, on business of his career. He wrote a letter of a different kind, a letter that was pious and formal, and that offered prayers, but that also, between the pious phrases, offered the reach of the church. If a papal legate were to come to Provence, Boniface said, that legate could be someone who understood the family. If a bull were needed on any point, a bull could be arranged. He did not need to be told what the family's interest was. He had been thinking about it for years. William, closest at hand, came in person. He rode down out of the mountains in October with a light retinue and arrived in Aix on a mild autumn afternoon. She met him in the courtyard, with her dowager's palm on her shoulder. He was a tall man with a long grave face and a habit of measured speech. He knelt there in front of the girl, and he told her that he was her uncle, and that he had come to help her, and that she was not to be afraid. She did not know how to answer. She looked at her dowager, and her dowager nodded, and she murmured in a soft voice that she was pleased he had come. He rose and picked her up briefly, and then set her down, and went into the house with the older woman. He stayed for 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, he did a great deal of quiet work. He met with the Chancellor Romy de Villeneuve and reviewed the state of the county's finances, and satisfied himself that Villeneuve was a man to be trusted. He met with the bishops of the county, one by one, and reminded them that a Savoyard child was to be protected. He met with the great lords of Provence and looked them in the eye, and did not need to say more than that. He wrote letters daily in an alpine lodging of a study upstairs that had been given over to him, and the letters went out in every direction, to Rome, to London, to the mountain, to the Rhone crossing at Avignon, to the papal legate at Lyons, to the King of France's court at Paris. He did what a Savoyard uncle in that century did. He put the family's weight down around his niece. He made it clear to everyone who might be watching that the girl in Aix was not alone in the world, and that any man who tried to take her by force would find himself dealing not with a widow and a child, but with the whole reach of the mountain house, and its reach, as a good part of Christendom had begun to notice, was considerable. By the time William went home, the situation in Aix was steadier than it had been in September. The Savoyard knights were quartered in the town. The letters had gone out. The Chancellor was working with a Savoyard clerk at his elbow. The Countess was writing every day. And the child, sitting at her mother's side in the audience chamber during long afternoons, was learning without being taught. The shape of what a family could do for a girl when the girl was worth doing something for. The winter of that 45th season went by in Aix with an unusual quiet. The Savoyard uncle's work held. The county sat still. But everyone in the household knew this was only the stillness before a storm, and that when spring came the suitors would come with it. They began to come in April. The first were the messengers, riding in one after another, each in the colours of a different lord, each with a letter, each asking to be received. Villeneuve received them in the audience chamber. He was courteous. He read the letters. He gave the messengers wine and bread and a spot to sleep. And he sent them out the next morning with polite words that promised nothing. The suitors themselves were several. There was, first, the King of Aragon, James I, who ruled a large realm on the other side of the Pyrenees and who sought the southern county for his son. James was a hard old fighter of a ruler, a crusader in his own way. And he had a claim that his forebears had once held the country and that a marriage would put it back in its right custody. His messengers were confident. They spoke of a broad fleet on the Catalan coast and of Barcelonan silver. There was, second, Raymond VII of Toulouse, who had spent most of his life fighting the northern French over the wreckage of the Albigensian Wars, and who was now looking to the east for his son's marriage. He was, of the suitors, the nearest in habit to the late Lord of Provence, and would have kept the south a Provençal country. But he was tired, and his cause was tired, and his messengers came with a slight air of a case that would not quite carry. There was, third, the Emperor Frederick II, who ruled the retinue of Sicily and the German territories, and who sought to have his son Conrad, or his son Manfred, wed into the inheritance. The reports differed on which son, because that land lay along the passage from the Empire's Italian holdings to the Empire's German ones, and to hold the Rhone was to hold that passage. Frederick was in that season at the height of his quarrel with the papacy, and any suitor of his was, for that reason alone, a difficult suitor. But Frederick did not care about difficulty. He sent messengers as if the marriage were his to arrange. There was, in addition, the ruler's northern neighbour, the Count of Barcelona, and various lesser suitors from the great lay houses of the south. None of them serious. Louis IX of France, in Paris, watched all of this. He was, by then, a man in his 30s, sovereign of France for 2 decades, known already as a devout and orderly ruler, beginning to be spoken of as saintly. He had 2 younger brothers of marriageable age. The elder, Robert of Artois, was married to a considerable lady. The younger, Charles of Anjou, was 17 or 18 and not yet placed. Louis IX had given him the county of Anjou and the county of Maine as an appanage in the west, but he was ambitious and needed more. And the southern realm, the sovereign saw at once, would put a northern prince at the door of Italy. Louis IX moved carefully. He did not send a suitor's messenger. He sent instead a papal delegation, the papal legate for the region, a churchman of high standing, who came to Aix with all the appearance of a churchman making a routine visit, but who came in fact to speak to the dowager about the future of her daughter. She received him in her private quarters. They talked for a lengthy stretch. The legate laid out, without pressure, the case for the northern prince, that the youth was still growing, but would grow into a considerable man, that his brother in Paris was a devout monarch who could be trusted, that such a match would keep the county safe from the emperor, and that the French monarch himself was the husband of her eldest daughter and would therefore be already a brother by marriage. The lady listened and did not commit. But she began, from that meeting, to see the shape of the answer. Meanwhile, Aix was full of foreign horsemen. The Aragonese messengers were there, and Toulouse's men and the emperor's envoys. They were not quite besieging the comital residence, but they were close to it. They waited in the courtyard when the dowager crossed to the chapel. They waited in the audience chamber for hours at a stretch. They sent presents up to her private quarters, a chest of Spanish silks from the Aragonese, a hawk from the Toulousan, a silver drinking cup from an imperial envoy. She accepted the gifts with courtesy and made no promises. The heiress herself, at 11, going on the next age, was kept out of most of this. She spent that spring in the interior halls of the residence, with her dowager, with the chamberwoman, with William, who was back for a further visit, with a close circle of women who kept her at her lessons and would not let strangers into her presence. She knew that men had come to try to marry her. She was old enough for that. She was not old enough to understand the whole calculation behind it. That the southern county was a piece on a very large board, and that whichever player took her would have moved a piece of consequence. But she felt the pressure of the closed doors, and she felt the tension in the dowager's shoulders when her mother came into her private quarters at the end of a day, and she was not a foolish child. Then, in a night of that spring, French knights arrived. They came in at dark, quietly, with the papal legate at their head, and they took quarters in the courtyard and in the streets around the residence. They were not many, but they were enough. The Toulouse men and the imperial envoys woke in the morning to find the courtyard held by French mounted men, and they understood at once what had been decided. The Aragonese messengers protested formally to the Chancellor. Villeneuve answered, formally, that his lady would receive their protests in due course. The Emperor's man rode out that afternoon, angry, and went east to send word to his master. The scramble was over. Anjou was on the way already. He had ridden south with a French escort, through the pass from Lyon down to Aix, through the winter valleys of Dauphine, and into the Rhône country, and he came into Aix in the last days of the month. A man of 19 on a good horse, with the marks of the route on him, and the beginning of a beard that would fill in later. He was received by the dowager in the audience chamber, in a ceremony that was formal but not warm, and he was quartered in a wing of the residence that had been made ready for him. She did not see him yet. Her dowager told her only that a northern prince had arrived, that the marriage was arranged, and that she would meet him at the wedding, which would be in January. The heiress was told this in her elder's private quarters, with the door closed. She listened. She did not cry. She asked, once, what he was like. Her dowager thought for a moment, and answered only that he was a youthful man, that he was Louis IX's brother, and that he would be a considerable figure in due course. The child nodded in the grave way she had begun to have, and remarked that she was glad it was decided. Her elder kissed her on the top of the head. The candle at the table burned down. Her fate had been decided by others, in the way of a high-born maid of her rank. But it had been decided by the family who loved her, guided by the mother who had thought about it every day of her widowhood, and shielded by the Savoyard reach of her uncles, and blessed by a papal legate who had come south for that very purpose. Given the world she lived in, and given what the alternatives had been, it was as good a decision as could be made. The southern county would go with a French prince. The family would hold. The heiress would be married. The wedding was set for the end of January, on the day of the conversion of St. Paul. The cathedral of Aix, which was called Saint Sauveur, stood on the highest ground of the borough, and it had a stone nave with pale pillars and a vast, cool interior in which the January light came in cold and clean through the eastern openings. The Bishop of Aix prepared for the day for a fortnight. The vestments were brought out, shaken and aired. The silver candlesticks were polished. The floor was swept. The chapter of canons rehearsed the responses. The comital chapel and the cathedral's choir together would make a considerable body of voices. Snow lay on the ridges around the borough in that month. This was not the harsh snow of the northern realms, but the light dusting of the south, gone from the streets by the middle of the morning, only patched in the shadowed corners of the courtyards. It was cold enough that fires burned all day in every hall, and the household brought in extra almond, kindling from the countryside, to keep the vast dining space warm. Aix smelled of wood smoke and of the winter olives brought in for the feast, and the market square had a stall of spiced wine that the people of the borough bought from in the afternoons. The bride was fitted for her gown in the days before. It was made of a heavy silk that had been brought up from the coastal port, a pale gold colour like the ochre stone of X, and it was worked at the sleeves and at the hem with a border of silver leaves. Over it went a mantle of a darker red, lined with white fur, that had been her mother's before it was hers. On her head went a veil of thin linen held in place, with a circlet of silver set with 3 blue stones. She was almost of age. She was tall for her years, but still a child. The gown had been let out at the sleeves twice already, because she had grown in the winter. The morning of the wedding she woke early. Her chamberwoman came in with a lamp and helped her wash her face and hands in a basin of warmed water. She was dressed by her mother and by 2 women of the household. The silk gown, the mantle, the veil, the circlet. Leather shoes worked with a running vine. She was given a little bread and a little wine, and told that she must eat, because she would not have another chance for many hours. She ate a piece of bread and drank a mouthful of wine. Her mother did not speak much. She had been up half the night at her writing table, making sure that the last of the marriage settlement was clean. The whole borough came out to see her walk. Her residence and the Cathedral of Aix were not far apart. A short passage through the streets, past the fountain, past the market, up the mild rise to the cathedral square. The procession went at a measured pace. The dowager walked at her daughter's right side. William walked at her left. Behind them came the lords of the county and the household knights, and the Chancellor Romy de Villeneuve in his own black gown of ceremony. Ahead of them went the bishop's cross and 2 boys with candles. The people of the borough lined the streets in their winter cloaks and looked at the bride and did not cheer, because it was not a cheering day, but bowed their heads a bit as she passed. Some of the older women crossed themselves. 1 or 2 wept a bit for her. Anjou waited at the cathedral door. He wore, over a tunic of dark blue, a mantle of a rich crimson, and at his belt was a sword whose hilt was worked with the arms of France. He was tall for his years and not yet filled out into the heavy build he would carry later. His hair was the light brown of the northern French. Cut short, he had a lengthy face, a straight nose, and eyes that did not smile, even when the rest of his face did. He was 19. He had ridden in the last few days from Angers and had spent them in his lodgings and had scarcely seen his bride. He looked at her now, coming up the last of the rise on her mother's hand, and he did not smile. He inclined his head. He offered her his own arm. She placed her palm in his. It was not a warm gesture on either side. He was a stranger, and she was a lass of not quite her age of majority, but she had been told what to do, and she did it. Together, they turned and went into the cathedral, up the nave, between the ranks of the assembled lords of France and the south, to the altar. The bishop was waiting there. The choir sang. The words of the marriage were spoken in Latin, and the ring was blessed, and her husband slid it onto her finger. And the 2 of them knelt on the cold stone of the choir and received the blessing. Incense hung in the cathedral air, blue and heavy. The candles on the altar burned tall. Somewhere in the streets a bell was ringing. Then it was done. They stood up. They turned and walked out of the cathedral together, arm in arm, into the January light of the square outside, and the people who had waited in the cold crossed themselves as they passed. The residence had been made ready for the feast. The vast chamber had been hung with new banners. The arms of the county at one end, and the arms of France at the other, and the arms of Anjou in the middle. The tables had been laid with white cloths. The kitchens had been at work since before dawn. There was to be venison and lamb, and small birds roasted, and wintergreens dressed with olive oil, and pastries of quince and spiced wine, and a large pie in the middle of the head table, shaped like the tower of the residence itself. The feast went on into the evening. The bride sat at the head table between her husband and her mother, and she ate very little because she was tired and because she was watched. Her husband sat straight and drank moderately and spoke to the men on his other side about the highways and about the hunting. He did not speak much to his wife, but he did not ignore her either. He turned to her at intervals and asked her in a formal way whether she was warm enough, whether the food pleased her, whether she wished for more wine. She answered him quietly. He nodded. That was the way of a formal marriage in that century, between a groom of some years and a bride not yet fully grown. They would come to know each other later. For the moment they were by the marriage a couple, and the county had passed by the sealing of a parchment out of the hand of a widowed dowager and into the hand of a French prince, who now had, through his wife, the right to call himself ruler of the southern county. The songs began in the second half of the evening. A troubadour of Aix, an old man well known to the household, sang a poem of praise for the youthful countess and her new husband. He sang it in the Languedoc, in the old measure, and even the groom, who did not speak the Languedoc well, listened politely and gave the old man a silver coin at the end. A boy with a small harp sang after that. The tables were cleared. The guests began to drift out into the courtyard, where a bonfire had been lit in a brazier, and to warm their hands. She was taken to her upper chamber early. It was still her old sleeping place, but it had been prepared differently. The wide bed had been dressed with a new red coverlet, and a new curtain hung around it, and candles had been placed on both sides. Her chamberwoman helped her out of the gown, and the mantle, and the veil, and into a plain night shift. She sat on the edge of the bed. She was very tired. Her dowager came in a bit later and sat with her for a while and stroked her hair and did not converse much. Then her elder left. Her husband came in. He was courteous. He sat on the other side of the bed. He murmured very few words. What passed between them that night is not for a chronicler to know. It was, by every custom of that century, a formal thing rather than a warm one, arranged around the fact that the bride was still a child. The chroniclers report only that the marriage was consummated in due course, in the sense the church required, which may or may not mean that first night. Many houses in that age understood that a very tender bride was not fit for a full marriage and waited a season or two. What is clear is that the two of them began, from that January, to be a married couple, and that a few days later they would ride out of Aix together, as husband and wife, toward the north for the household and for the dowager and for the borough of Aix. The wedding was the vast matter and the vast turning. A daughter of the settlement had become the wife of a French prince, and the county had been sealed over to Anjou, and the 12 months of the widow's guardianship were in effect at an end. The next morning the household began to think about spring. The gown was laid away in a chest with sprigs of lavender. The mantle was put back on its peg. The circlet was returned to its box. The county went on, under new masters, into what would come next. The court that she entered as her husband's wife was a rolling one. That is the initial thing to note. It did not sit still. He was a lithe man of considerable energy who held lands from the Loire to the Mediterranean, and he intended to see all of them. In the early years of the marriage, the couple travelled with a regularity that would have surprised the dowager, who had lived at Aix for most of her adult life. Aix in the cold, the Rhône castle when the fields flowered, Angers when the vines ripened, Paris for vast occasions, Aix again in the late autumn. The baggage carts were loaded and unloaded, so much that the clerks kept a running list of what had been packed in each chest. Her husband at 20 was a man of considerable presence. He had grown into the beard that had been only beginning on his wedding day, and it filled in dark, and it gave his lean face a graver look. He was taller than most of his men, and he sat well on a horse. He was known already in the courts of the north for a certain coldness of manner. He did not laugh easily. He did not drink much. He was polite and correct with women. He was, in the field, a hard commander whose men respected him without loving him. He worked for very lengthy hours. He read every letter that came into his chancery. He kept his own accounts in his own hand, in a slim book that he carried with him. The chroniclers who wrote about him afterwards, mostly the Italian chroniclers who had reason to dislike him, described him as ambitious, hard, and cold. Even the friendlier writers agreed that he was above all a man of will. He had decided young that he would be a leading figure of the age, and he set about being one with a steady application that did not vary. He did not indulge himself. He did not waste his energy. He did not, so far as any chronicler could see, love easily. What he did was work and think and command, and by these means he built. She found herself, in her earliest teens, the wife of such a man. It was not an easy position. She was tender. She had been raised in a warm nursery of siblings and by a mother who read her gentle books of stories in the last light of the afternoon. She was married now to a man who read charters at his own writing table late into the night and who had, so far as one could tell, no particular hour for the light games of a youthful wife. But he was not, in the way of some husbands of that age, unkind. He treated her with a formal correctness that never varied. He addressed her by her rank before her household. He rode beside her when they moved, and did not go on ahead. He came to her bedside when he was supposed to, and left when he was supposed to. She adjusted by degrees. She had her chamberwoman with her, the one who had been with the family since before the eldest was born, and this was a considerable help. She corresponded with her dowager in X at least once a week, and sometimes more often, and her dowager sent back news and gentle counsel, how to run a household of moving carts, how to answer a formal note from a bishop, what to do when a clerk of the chancery came in with a page for her to sign. She also kept afloat to her siblings, the eldest in Paris, the next in London, the Cornish one in the West Country. She did not always get answers as quickly as she liked, because they had their own lives to run, but she kept up her end. The Angevin castle at Angers was of the many places they lived, the one she came to know best in those first years. It sat on a hill above the river Main, with a set of thick round towers newly built by his mason, and it looked out over the Loire country. The Loire region was not like Provence. The air was softer and wetter, the trees were larger, the grass was greener in the summer and heavier with dew. There was fog in the mornings. In a way there had not been in Aix, a heavy white mist that lay over the river and did not lift until the sun had been up for an hour. She, who had grown up in the cicada land of the south, learned to hear a different set of morning noises. The crow of a rooster, carried through fog, the measured drip of water off the eaves of a slate roof, the deep bell of the Angers Cathedral rolling out over the settlement in a way that the light bells of Aix had never done. She learned Angers's household. She learned the great room with its horse rings set into the walls at the tie-up posts. She learned the smells of the kitchens, which were larger than X's kitchens and produced more elaborate food. She learned above all to be a countess in a place where she was a stranger. The Angevin lords who came in to pay their respects to the young Countess of Provence did not always know what to make of her. She was southern. She was young. She was not yet fully into her own strength. She was gracious with them. She learned their names. She learned which of them her husband liked and which of them her husband tolerated. She stored all of this quietly in a mind that had begun. In the 6 months after the wedding, to be a mind of its own. She was carrying a babe in the early middle of the marriage. This is a matter the chroniclers do not report much about, because such things in that age were not a topic one set down in public correspondence. But it seems that she was with child by the warm months of the 47th summer, and that a daughter was born to her, and that the babe lived. The eldest was called Blanche, after her husband's own dam, the Queen up north. The upper suite in that Angevin castle was made ready for the narrow quarters that a new matron needed. A wet nurse was brought in from a hamlet nearby, a woman with a good milk supply and a calm bearing. A wooden cradle of oak was set at the foot of the mother's bed. A fresh coverlet was made. She was young for it. She was 14, perhaps 15. Her own dowager sent her a long note of practical advice. How to know when the milk was coming in, what to do when the broken nights ran into the long nights, how to keep a chamberwoman by her at all times because a young matron should not be alone. She sent, along with the parchment, a set of linen wraps that had been the Cornish daughter's and Beatrice's own. She sent a silver spoon for the babe at Heine. The tiny one Blanche was carried into the chapel of the castle at Angers and baptized by the household chaplain. Her sire, waiting at the font in his court dress, with his sword at his side, looked down at the red face of his firstborn with the measured attention he gave a charter. He did not smile in the ordinary way. He only laid a palm briefly on the linen wrap over the babe, and the chaplain saw it and remembered it later. Her dam kept to her lying-in quarters in the days that followed the birth, cradled the babe close in the fog of the Angers mornings, rocked her and sang her lullabies of the south in the Languedoc, because those were the songs she knew, and because a newborn does not care what language a cradle tune is in. She became, in the 12 months that followed, a matron in the way of the countesses of that age. A second babe was born, and a third would arrive in due course. The nursery at Angers, and later the one at Aix when they went south, grew fuller. She herself, who at 14 had been a babe of the Provençal cradle chamber, at 18 was the mistress of such a household of her own, travelling between the north and the south with her young ones and her wet nurses and her cradles. She became, also, the countess her husband ruled through. That phrase carries some weight, and it is a fair description. He was, in law and in fact, ruler of the county by right of his wife. He held it because he had married her. That meant, in practice, that all his charters and letters were issued in both their names. Jointly, she signed. She sealed. She had a chancery of her own in Aix, run by a clerk her mother had picked for her. He did not do her the discourtesy of ruling in her stead without her presence. Whether he did her the courtesy of ruling with her actual counsel is a harder question. He had a mind of his own, but the marriage worked in that sense, that it was not an empty formality on her side. The papers went out under both names. The realm was theirs. The seasons went by in a steady rhythm. The moving court, the fresh births, the quiet triumphs and quiet crises of a comital estate. Her husband's power grew apace. His brother in Paris, on the throne of France, watched him with satisfaction. Her own dowager in Aix sent lengthy approving notes. The Chancellor Romy de Villeneuve, still in his office, ran the south competently. She, in her chambers at Angers or Acre, held her eldest, then a younger, then a third born, and grew into her matronhood by the practice of it. She was 17, she was 18, she was 20. And then, in the autumn of the 48th autumn, or perhaps somewhat earlier, word came out of Paris that the pious king would take the cross, and that his brothers would go with him, and that the county too would send a fleet east. Louis IX of France had taken the cross earlier than the 12-month the fleet sailed. He had taken it in the winter of 44. After a severe illness that had brought him very close to death, and he had made the vow in the manner of that century formally, with his hand on a relic and his voice raised in the church. But it had taken years to prepare. Holy expeditions in the middle of the 13th century were not the affairs of a single year. They were the affairs of half a decade. The men had to be raised, the money had to be gathered, the ships had to be built. The treaties with the Italian merchant cities had to be settled, and the diplomacy with the emperor and the pope had to be conducted with vast care. Because such a venture was a considerable absence and left a kingdom exposed. Andrew took the cross with his brother. He did this in the spring of 48, or perhaps a little earlier, in a ceremony at Paris that the chroniclers do not describe in much detail. What they do report is that he threw himself into the preparation of it with his usual energy. He was to bring a body of French knights from the Angevin domains, and he was to bring, from his wife's southern county, a considerable fleet. She heard of the expedition first by letter, and then, when her husband came south to Aix that summer, by direct conversation. She had been in Aix through the pregnancy of her second babe. She was, at that hour, either about to give birth or just delivered. The chroniclers vary, and she was in the state of a matron in the first heavy weeks after a birth. He came to her private apartment and sat by the bed and told her about the vow. She listened. She looked at the babe in the cradle. She answered, what a wife of that century answered in that circumstance, which was that God's will was to be done, and that she would pray for the venture every day. Then she thought about it for a week, in her own mother's manner of thinking, and she came to her husband and told him that she wanted to go too. He was surprised, or pretended to be. He asked her whether she understood what the Eastern expedition was. She answered that she did. She was the sister of the Queen of France. And she had been reading pages from her eldest for a fair while, and she understood something of what it meant. She went on, that her eldest sister herself was going, and that a Provençal countess, whose county was contributing so many ships and so many men, should not stay behind. She added that she had thought about the children, and that they would be safe in Aix with her dowager, and that the household would hold firm. She noted, at last, in a quieter voice, that she did not want to be 4 seasons without her spouse, and that she did not want him to be that time without her, and that if a wife of her age could go with her husband on such a matter, she would go. He considered it. He was, as we have noted, a cold man in his ordinary manner, but he was not stupid, and he was not cruel. He looked at his wife. She was in her mid-teens still, and she had already borne 2 children, and she was proposing to sail east with him. And he answered, after some thought, that if she wished to go, she could go, and that he would make the arrangements. He would take her as his own household, in her own tents, with her own women. He would keep her behind the sea-wall of any camp they made. He would not, he added, expose her to what the soldiers were exposed to. She agreed that was fair and thanked him, and that was the arrangement. The rest of 48 and the first months of 49 were the preparation. Her husband was often away, riding between his own domains and Paris, seeing to the raising of men. She, in Aix, gave herself to the outfitting of her household for the voyage. Chests were packed with linen and with medicines and with a few books. A chaplain of her own was chosen. A physician of her own was engaged. 2 of her chamberwomen would go with her. The rest would stay in Aix, with her dowager to keep the babes. The young ones, Blanche and the second, and possibly a third by then, the chroniclers are unclear, would remain in Aix. The port from which they were to sail was Aigues-Mortes. This harbour was a new one. It had been chosen and built, more or less from scratch, by Louis IX himself, because the King of France did not want to owe his expedition to the coastal port, which was still not fully under royal control or to Genoa, which was foreign. Aigues Mortes lay on a stretch of the Languedoc shore where a canal could be dug from the settlement to the open sea, and where the Tower of Constance and the outer walls were new-cut stone in the summer of '48. Still, with the mason's chisel, marks fresh on them. The place smelled of hemp rope and of tar. The rope came in on carts from the countryside and was coiled on the quay in great wet coils. The tar came in barrels from the coasts. The ship timbers came down the Rhone from the alpine forests and were pulled ashore for the shipwrights to work on. She went down to Aigues Mortes in the last week of the summer of '48, or possibly not until early '49. The chroniclers give both dates. She rode down out of Aix in a train of covered carts, with her women and her chaplain and her physician, and she came into Aigues Mortes at dusk on a hot day, and she saw for the first time the fleet that was being gathered there. It was a considerable sight. There were ships from the coastal port and from Genoa and from Venice, and there were vessels that had been built newly on the beach, and there were smaller boats for the household stores and the animals. The masts were a small forest on the water. The sails were furled. The horses were being led up onto the ships by ramps of oak planking. Men in the red badge of the Crusaders were everywhere. She was shown to her lodgings. She had a plain apartment in a merchant's residence near the water. She slept badly that night, because the sea sounded strange in her ear. She had grown up inland at Aix, and though she had been to the seaport as a visitor, she had never slept in a house on the water. In the morning, she went out to look at the ship that would carry her. It was a considerable vessel, with 2 masts and a broad deck, and a raised castle at the stern where her chamber would be. The captain was a Genoese man of steady experience, spare and grey. He bowed to her deeply and showed her, in a mixture of Italian and Languedoc, where she would sleep, and where her women would sleep, and where her stores would be kept. The red badge had been sewn onto her mantle. She wore it now over her shoulder, as all the Crusaders did, a square of red cloth stitched to the wool. She looked at it in a mirror the night before they sailed. She was 16 years of age, or 17. She was going east on a fleet with the King of France, her brother-in-law, and with the Queen, her elder sister. She thought, standing in front of the mirror, that this was the strangest thing she had ever imagined for herself, and that, if her father had lived, he might have been proud. The fleet sailed at the end of August. The sea was flat under a summer haze. The sails came up on the masts one after another, and the ships pulled away from the quays and slid down the canal and out into the open water. She stood on the deck of her ship, at the rail, with her hood down. She looked back at Aigues Mortes as the harbour slipped away. The Tower of Constance, the low walls, the smell of hemp and tar, carried on the last of the shore breeze. Then she looked forward. The sea before them was empty and blue. The south was behind, the east was ahead, and the fleet, in an unhurried line, began the crossing. The crossing to Cyprus in that 48th autumn was, by the standards of that century, a good one. The winds held. The fleet did not scatter as badly as it might have. There were losses. Some ships took water in a storm off Sardinia, and one, an animal ship, went down with all its horses, which was accounted a heavy grief. But the main body of the fleet arrived at Limassol in the second half of September, in more or less good order. Cyprus was, in that season, a Frankish kingdom. It had been in the hands of the Lusignan family for 2 generations, since Richard the Lionheart had taken it in the earlier expedition and passed it to them. The Cypriot lord at this time was Henry I, a courteous man of middle years who received Louis IX and his fleet with the honour that his rank owed to the King of France. He had prepared for them. He had cleared his harbour. He had readied his palaces. He had bought in stores of grain and salt meat from the countryside. because the Western fleet numbered many thousands of men and many hundreds of horses, and could not be fed off Limassol alone. Louis IX's decision to winter in Cyprus, rather than press on to Egypt at once, was the decision of a careful sovereign. The season was late. The Egyptian campaign would need spring weather and a fresh army. It would be better, he thought, to rest the men and refit the ships and gather the reinforcements that were still coming from the west. He did this against the counsel of some of his more impatient advisers, who wanted to sail at once. But he was the sort of man who did what he had decided, and so the expedition stayed in Cyprus for the winter. Her household was quartered in Nicosia, the capital of the island, which lay in a wide plain in the middle of the country, about a day's ride from the coast. She rode up from Limassol in a light train of horses in the first week of October. The way went inland through terrain that was not like anything she had seen before. There were vineyards, but the vines were different, thicker in the stem, growing on pergolas instead of on low stakes as they did at home. There were olive trees, but their leaves were paler. There were citron trees, which she had never seen at all, with their round green fruits still hanging like heavy globes. The sun was different too. At home, the sun of October had already begun to soften. Here it was still hard and white, and it beat on the way as the sun of July might have beaten in Aix. She rode in a light veil of white linen against it, and her physician had made her a paste of oil and honey to keep her lips from cracking. Nicosia was a settlement of low whitewashed walls and quiet courtyards. It had been the capital of the island for some seasons and had the shape of a settled locale. A cathedral, a market, streets that ran on straight lines. The Cypriot queen received her in the palace of the Lusignans, a stone building with painted ceilings and a courtyard of fig trees. The lady was a woman of about her own age, or a little older, and they got on. They spoke in the northern French of the courts, which they both understood. They talked about their children, whom they had both left behind. They talked about the expedition. They walked on cool afternoons in the palace garden, where a fountain played and where a green parrot in a cage would call out in Greek at whoever passed. She kept her own court within the palace. She had her chaplain saying mass every morning in a chapel that had been set aside for her. She had her physician doing his rounds. She had her women managing her linens and her supply of medicines. She penned to her dowager in Aix every week, and the pages went out with the Crusade's own couriers, back to the ships and thence west, by any Genoese vessel that would take them. Some arrived in Aix and some did not. The Countess of Savoy sent back news of the children. Blanche was well. The second was well. The elder woman slipped tight, pressed flowers from the Provençal garden inside the folded parchments, so that she, opening them on a Cypriot afternoon, would smell for a moment the lavender of home. Her husband was often not in Nicosia. He was down at Limassol with his brothers, seeing to the ships. He came up when he could, usually for a few days at a stretch, and he stayed with her in the palace, and they had lengthy conversations of a kind they had not had space for at Angers or at Aix. It was one of the strange effects of the Crusade that it forced them together in a way ordinary life had not. In their ordinary days they had houses and lands to run, and children to see to, and pages to answer. Here, in a foreign court, with the Crusade in its cold pause, they had hours to spare. He talked to her about his brothers. He talked to her, in a way that was rare for him, about his own boyhood. She talked to him about her siblings and her dowager. She did not tell him everything about them, because there were things that Margaret and Eleanor had penned to her about her that she did not share. But she talked, and he listened, and something was built between them that had not been quite there before. Sickness came into the western encampment that winter. This was to be expected, an army in a strange land, in close quarters, with strange food and strange water, always sickened. Fever ran through the men at Limassol. Some died. The physicians moved between the camps and did what they could. The eldest, up in her own household in Nicosia, was also unwell for a while, and she went to her sibling and sat with her for a day or two, and they made peace of a simple kind. Not the vast peace of the inheritance quarrel, which would take longer, but a plain peace of two who were far from home and unwell in a foreign country, and glad, for a moment, to see each other. The Northern Queen was pregnant again by then. She was already, at that age, a dam of several children, and this was her third or fourth pregnancy. The winter passed. Cyprus was mild by the standards of a European winter. Though the Franks complained that it rained too much in January and that the highways turned to mud, the men in the camps grew restless. The horses were kept in shape by steady rides in the fields beyond the town. The fleet was cleaned, reprovisioned. The wine of the island, which was a heavy, sweet vintage of ancient tradition, was drunk in great quantities in the great room of the Lusignan lord. The queens sat in embroidered chairs at feast tables and spoke to each other in careful voices and prayed together in the palace chapel in the mornings. In April, or perhaps in the last week of March, the order was given to move. The winter was over. The season was right. The fleet at Limassol was ready. The men were embarked. The horses were led up the ramps. The queens were escorted down from Nicosia to Limassol in a lengthy train of covered carts. She took a last look at the whitewashed walls of Nicosia and at the fig tree courtyard where she had spent so many afternoons. And she rode down the dusty road to the coast. Her ship was ready. Her cabin at the stern had been aired out and freshened. Her chaplain had blessed the deck. The vast fleet, larger by many ships than it had been when it left Aigues-Mortes, was preparing to sail for Egypt. They sailed on a clear morning at the beginning of May, with the wind fair. The dust of the island receded. The blue horizon of the eastern sea opened. Ahead lay the Nile mouth and the port of Damietta and the campaign that Louis IX had been planning for years. She, standing again at the rail of her ship, looked ahead and prayed a quiet prayer of her mother's teaching, and she prepared her mind as best she could for whatever the summer would bring. The Nile at Damietta emptied into the sea through a delta of low land and tall reeds and heavy brown water. When the Western fleet came into the mouth in early June of 49, the first sight the Crusaders had of Egypt was that vast flatness sky and water, almost the same colour, and a low green line where the reeds began, and further inland, the pale walls of the port on the eastern side of the river. The landing was fought. That is a matter for the military chroniclers, and it is not for a listening chronicle to go into. What can be said, briefly, is that Louis IX himself waded ashore in the first line, with his brothers close behind him, and that the Egyptian force that had been drawn up on the beach was pushed back, and that the Crusaders held the beach that day, and that within a few days Damietta itself was in their grasp. The garrison of the settlement, whether from panic or from good strategic sense, had withdrawn without much of a fight. The gates were open. The Western host walked into a walled port on the Nile with almost no cost to itself. She did not see any of this. She was on her ship, which had been ordered to hold well off the coast during the countrying, and she came ashore later, after the settlement was taken, with the other women of the Western household. She came into Damietta through the water gate on a morning when the port was still very much in the state of hurry that follows an evacuation. The Egyptian townspeople had gone. The dwellings were open, empty. The market squares were littered with the plain things people leave behind when they leave in a hurry. A broken jar, a wooden shoe, a woven basket, half full of onions. Quartermasters were going through the streets, one street at a time, marking doors with chalk for the officers who would take those buildings. The Western establishment, the monarchs and Anjous and Robert of Artois, and that of the queens, took over a set of houses in the best district of Damietta, near the mosque that would be turned into a cathedral. She was given her own lodging, close to the mosque, that had belonged to a rich merchant. It had a small yard, shaded by a citron tree, and a dry basin where the aqueduct no longer fed water, and a set of tiled floors above. She moved in with her women. She hung her own coverings. She had a private oratory prepared in one of the higher spaces. Her chaplain said mass in it on the first evening. But that walled port was not to be her main lodging in the hot months. That would be outside the walls. Her spouse and his brothers had chosen, for reasons of strategy, that the host would encamp on flat ground east of the estuary. That meant a broad canvas city on the low bank, and any wife who wished to be near her husband had to be lodged in linen as well. She, alongside her eldest sibling and the other great ladies, took a pavilion behind the seawall through the hottest months of the campaign. The tents were made of a heavy canvas dyed dark to keep off the sun. Hers was one of the larger ones, hung inside with linen curtains to make separate spaces, and floored with palm mats woven by the Egyptian craftsmen of the port. It had a brazier in the middle for the cool evenings, though the evenings on the Nile were seldom truly cool in June and July. It had a bed of ropes stretched over a wooden frame, with a linen mattress and a cotton coverlet. It had a table with a folding chair. It had a chest for her clothes and a lighter chest for her medicines. 2 of her women slept in a lesser tent alongside. A guard of Provençal soldiers slept on a mat outside the door. Life in the camp, from her window on it, was a matter of ordinary textures, the reed and the canvas, the palm frond shade that the Egyptian labourers put up around the water jars to keep the drink cool. The smell of the Nile at low tide, which is not the smell of the sea and not the smell of a river of the south either, but a slow, warm smell of mud and green things, the hot dust of the ground between the tents, which lifted at every footstep and hung in the air for a long moment before it settled. The heat, which was heavier than the heat of Provence, because it did not lift at night. She kept a jar of Nile water, cooled with a wet linen cloth wrapped around it, a trick her Egyptian steward had taught her, and she and her women drank slowly from it through the day, filling the cup and setting it back in the damp wrapping. Her eldest sister was in the tent next to hers. They saw each other every morning and every evening. That elder was very pregnant by then. She would give birth in the walled port later in that summer, in circumstances that would make her the subject of one of the more famous chapters of any chronicle of the expedition. But in June and July she was still large and slow, and she sat much of the day on a wide chair with a footstool. The younger would sit with her, and they would sew a while, and they would talk. The peace they had made in Cyprus deepened somewhat in Egypt. They were, in the encampment, only 2 siblings far from home in a strange land. The vast inheritance quarrel was not spoken of. The elder sometimes put her hand on the younger's arm in a way she had done when the youngest was a small child, and the youngest let her. The men, from June onwards, were preparing for the march inland. That preparation went on around the ladies' tents as a set of noises: the ring of a hammer on a horseshoe, the shout of a sergeant, the creak of a cart, the tread of a column being drilled. In the mornings, the columns went out to practice their formations on the flat ground east of the encampment. In the evenings, the men came back, and the campfires were lit. The Queen's tents were kept apart from all of this by a canvas screen, and their food was brought to them by their own household, and they did not usually go about the camp openly. But they knew what was happening. Their husbands told them at supper each night. The march inland was set for late autumn. The monarch wanted to move when the heat began to break. In the Meantime, the summer went by in a rhythm of ordinary tasks. She wrote her letters home. She kept a diary of sorts, in a book of parchment, in which she wrote a few lines a day about the weather and about ordinary things. A bird she had seen in the citron tree. A song a Provençal soldier had sung at dusk. A fever that one of her women suffered and recovered from. She read what books she had brought with her. She said her prayers with her chaplain in the morning and again in the evening. She lay on her rope bed at night and listened to the sound of the camp and thought about her young ones in Aix. It was, in a strange way, the quietest period of her life. She had no county to run at this distance. She had no household of many chambers to manage. She had a tent and a citron tree glimpsed over the canvas wall, and a sibling nearby who was heavy with child, and a spouse who came in from the drilling ground at the end of each day with dust on his boots. She would look up when he came in, and he would nod at her, and she would call for a drink, and he would sit down on the folding chair. Then he would tell her the news of the day, in his short manner. Then he would go out again. The summer went by like that. She sat in the shade of the palm fronds. The Nile went on flowing past. The march inland began in the autumn, when the heat had begun to slacken. The main body of the host set out under her spouse's brother, the pious king, up the eastern branch of the Nile, toward the forward base the enemy sultan had chosen. She and her elder sister came off the flats and back into their proper Egyptian dwellings again, safe inside the ring of stone, because winter was near and canvas would not do. The chronicle of what happened at Mansoura is not for this telling. What matters for this listening chronicle is the way the news reached Damietta, and what the women in Damietta did with it. Word came in stages. The first message came in late February, and it was hopeful. The western host had reached Mansoura and had begun to besiege it, and a battle had been fought at the outer camp in which Anjou had performed well and had come through without harm. She received the message in her upper chamber over the citron courtyard, from a Provençal knight who had ridden hard from the camp. She thanked him. She sent him down to the household to be fed. She sat in her window afterwards for a lengthy stretch and gave thanks. The second word came in March, and it was mixed. The army had suffered heavy losses at a fight in the streets of Mansoura. Robert of Artois, Louis IX's brother, her husband's brother, the elder of the brothers-in-law, had been killed. He had ridden into the settlement with his knights and had been surrounded and struck down. The messenger brought it to the monarch's household first, and thence to the northern queen's. She heard from her sister's own woman, who came to her residence in the afternoon. She went at once to her sibling. Her elder was in her private room, only a few weeks from her own delivery. She was very quiet when the visitor came in. She murmured only, "Robert is gone." She sat with her. They did not weep in front of the women. They sat together, side by side, for the whole of an afternoon. Robert had been their brother-in-law, and he had also been a boy they had known. The third message came in April, and it was very bad. The king had been taken. He had been captured, with what remained of the main army, in a retreat down the Nile that had gone badly. He was in the grip of the Sultan. The other princes with him were also in the Sultan's grasp. Her husband was among them. The expedition, as a fighting force, no longer existed. Word reached Damietta in the last hour of a day at the end of April, or the first days of May. The messenger was a Templar, dust to the ankles, half blind with the ride, and he told his tidings to the constable of the settlement. And the constable came at once to the great houses. He came to the monarch's household first. Then he came to her elder sisters. Then he came to hers. She was in the chapel when he arrived, having just heard her own chaplain say vespers. She came out into the courtyard when they told her the constable was there, and she waited in her mantle with her hands folded and heard the tidings. She did not cry. She was, at that instant, 16 or 17 years of age, and she had been on this venture for the better part of 2 seasons, and she had learned to receive hard tidings with a certain steadiness. She listened, she asked a question or two, she thanked the constable. Then she went upstairs to her own study and closed the door. She was in that room for perhaps an hour. Then she came down. She sent for her chaplain and for her chief woman and for the Provençal captain of her guard. She told them, in her calm voice, that they must think about the days ahead. She noted that Damietta was likely to be attacked. She added that the Queen's households must be ready either to defend the settlement or to negotiate for the king's release. She observed that she trusted them all, and that she would need their good sense. Then she went to her sibling. Her elder was in the last week of her pregnancy. She was not well, she was not sleeping, she was not eating. She was in the state of a woman who is at once frightened and about to give birth. She was in a curtained inner space in her own residence, with her woman by the bed, and the space smelled of the linen and of the herb tea that the physician had brewed for her. The younger came in and sat by the bed. She took her sister's hand. She murmured, in a voice her elder would remember for seasons afterwards, that she was there and that she would stay, and that they would come through this together. The labour began that night, or the next. It was an arduous labour. The chroniclers, later, would make much of the fact that the mother gave birth in a besieged port, with her husband captive, with the western host in ruins, and that she named the child Jean Tristan, meaning John of Sadness, for the circumstances of his birth. Some chroniclers say that in her extremity she made a knight who was in the chamber swear that if the Muslim army entered the settlement before her delivery, he would strike off her head to save her from capture, and that he swore it. Others say this is a legend. What is certain is that the labour was difficult, that the child was born alive, and that her sister was at the bedside for most of it, holding a cloth to her sibling's forehead, or standing at the foot of the bed with a candle, or sitting on a low stool by the door. The days after the birth were the days of the ransom negotiations. The Sultan, having caught the King of France, was in a strong position, but he was also in a position of a certain kind of difficulty. He had on his hands one of the most valuable prisoners of the century, and every day of the captivity was a day the Western host might attack him from the sea, or the emirs of his own court might quarrel over what to do. He wanted a settlement. The women in Damietta wanted a settlement. What was needed was gold, and the promise of the surrender of the port. Her elder raised the money. That is the part of the story that made her famous afterwards. Still weak from her lying in, she sent her clerks and her men to the merchants of Damietta and to the ships still in the harbour, and she took loans on the credit of the Northern Crown for the ransom of her spouse. And she promised bills of exchange to be drawn on Genoa and the Provençal port. And she gathered, by a heroic effort, the sum that was needed. Her sibling helped her. Her own household plate, the silver dishes she had brought with her, the modest treasures of her chaplain, she put into the ransom too. She penned a note to her dowager in Aix that must have crossed the sea in some vessel of the port, telling her elder what had happened and asking her to arrange with the Chancellor to pay whatever bills came in against her name. The ransom was paid. Damietta was surrendered. Louis IX and Anjou and the other captive lords were released. Her husband was among the first out of the Sultan's camp, being one of the leading princes. The king was released a bit later in a separate arrangement. He came into Damietta on a spring morning, thin and grave, walked into his own residence, where his queen and his newborn son waited. And he did not speak for a lengthy stretch. She was there when he came back to their residence. He walked into the courtyard in a plain riding cloak, with dust on his boots and a beard grown out for the captivity. And she came down the courtyard to meet him. He did not smile. He took her palm. He murmured only that they had been through a fair amount and that God had brought them out of it. She did not cry then either. She held his fingers, and they went upstairs together to their quarters. And she gave orders that he was to be brought warm water and clean clothes. The trembling household clerk, who had waited 3 months for that news, went into a corner and wept a little, and no one spoke to him. Louis IX did not go home at once. That was one of his great decisions, and it was much argued about at the time. The Kingdom of France was without its sovereign. His mother, Blanche of Castile, was ruling as regent and was aging. His advisers pressed him to return, but he had made a vow, and he had failed in the first part of it, and he would not, he said, leave the holy country while a captive Christian remained in Muslim hands and while a Christian city could still be fortified. He would remain in the East, and he would use the coming years to strengthen what could be strengthened. He went from Damietta, Acre, in the Frankish kingdom of Jerusalem, and he settled there. Anjou did not stay so long. He had different responsibilities. He had a wife who had been on this venture a lengthy stretch now, and a county that needed him, and lands in the north that were his own. He agreed with his brother that he would go home. He would leave in the autumn or in the following spring, when a ship could be found. She, of course, would go with him. She was, by this point, entirely ready to head home. Between Damietta and the sailing, however, they had a spell at Acre. Acre was, at that hour, the largest of the Frankish cities remaining in the east. It stood on a jut of land on the coast of what is now northern Israel, with its sea wall running around the walled ring and its harbour on the south side, and it was, in effect, the capital of what remained of the western East. It was a mixture, Frankish knights and their households, Italian merchants of Genoa and Venice and Pisa in their own quarters, native Christian communities of many rites, Jewish merchants, Muslim traders, refugees from every Frankish city that had fallen in the previous 50 years. It was, in language and in look, a jumbled locale. It smelled of the sea and of spices, sesame, honey, the strange, sharp spices of the Eastern trade, and its markets were louder and more crowded than any she had seen in the West. The monarch's household took the vast houses of the Frankish quarter. She and her husband had a dwelling near the sea wall, with an opening that looked out over the harbour. She could see, from that vantage, the ships of the Venture riding at anchor in the bay, and beyond them the open sea. She sat there in the mornings and drank the little cup of hot spiced water her steward had learned to make for her from a local recipe. She could hear the calls of the sailors on the vessels in 6 languages. Drifting up the wall on the sea breeze, the residence had, in one of its downstairs halls, a pane of Levantine glass. This was the first she had ever seen. The glass was cut in tiny pieces of many colours, set in a lattice of lead in a pattern of leaves and stars. When the sun was low, it threw coloured shadows onto the floor, red and green and blue, and she would move her palm into them and watch it turn colours. She penned a note to her dowager about the lattice, remarking that she wished her chamber at X had one like it, and that when she came home, she would try to have one made. The market of Acre was one of the pleasures of her stay there. She was allowed to go there with a light guard, veiled in her western way, and she would walk through the stalls in the mornings before the heat came up. She bought plain things, a tiny jar of sesame paste, a strip of dried apricot, a copper cup with a lid, a set of glass beads for her little ones in X. She learned a few phrases of the market Arabic that traders used with foreign customers, and she used them, and the traders laughed and gave her a friendly discount. She was, in Acre, more freely a private woman than she had been anywhere in her life. Nobody quite knew who she was. The decision to sail was taken in the spring. The Genoese captain who had brought her east came to see her husband and reported his ship was ready and that the wind would be right in early hot months. The date was set for June. In the weeks before, she went about the modest tasks of a departure. She paid the local people who had served her. She gave gifts to the churches of Acre. She made a plain donation to the Hospital of St. John, which was the chief charitable house of the Eastern Franks. She bade farewell to her sibling in the palace above, who was staying with Louis IX and would not be returning yet. The parting was not easy. The two had been together in the same enterprise for the better part of 4 seasons now, and though the inheritance quarrel would come between them again once they were in their own countries, in Acre they had been simply kin. The elder wept a little. She held her sister's palm. Then they went their different ways. The vessel left port at dawn in the last week of June. She kept to the deck at the rail. Her eyes stayed on the sea wall of Acre as it fell away, on the towers that had been her horizon for a 12-month, on the tender line of coast that gave way to the emptiness of open sea. Then she turned inward toward the prow. Before her the blue plain opened. Before her waited her home mole. Before her waited the west. The voyage west was longer. The voyage east had been. The winds were more variable, and the ship called in at several ports along the coast, a stop at Rhodes, a stop in Cyprus again, a stop in Sicily. Sicily she saw only from the ship's rail. She would come back there, later in her life, in a different capacity, but she did not know that then. The vessel came around the western end of Sicily and up the coast of Italy and across to home in the late summer. And one morning in early September, the coast of the county rose out of the water ahead. She recognized it before it was fully clear. She saw the low blue line of familiar hills, and then the pale white shape of a village, and then the great mole of the coastal harbour. The captain took his ship in on a good wind. The Provençal officials who had been waiting for weeks for news of her vessel saw it come in and sent word up to Aix. By the afternoon she was on the dock. She waited on the wooden planks of the mole in her western dress, with the smell of home coming to her on the shore breeze, the smell of pine and of dry stone and of the sea itself, and she gave thanks. The ride up to Aix took 2 days. She rode slowly. Her women were tired. Her husband rode ahead with a modest escort to arrange things at the residence. She took the route at her own pace, with her chaplain and her physician and her guard, and she stopped for the night at a village along the way, and she slept for the first time on Provençal soil. She woke early before dawn, and stood in the doorway of the village inn and listened. She heard a cicada, in the last dark hour before the sun came, singing in a fig tree. It was the sound she had gone away from years earlier, without knowing that she would come to miss it as much as she did. She lingered there in the dark and listened to it, and she wept not the vast weeping of a woman in distress, but the modest, quiet weeping of a matron who has come home. She rode into Aix the next day at high noon. The borough knew of her coming. Her mother waited at the gate of the residence. The children clustered beside her, the firstborn now a lass of 5 or 6, staring at this thin brown stranger with wide eyes, uncertain if she remembered her own dam. She swung down from her horse. Her mother took her in her arms. The child Blanche stepped forward at a slow pace. She raised the child. She held her a lengthy heartbeat. Then she caught the elder's gaze over her firstborn's hair. And she smiled, the first grin she had worn properly in a good while, and she spoke, in the Languedoc of her cradle, the word for home. The realm to which the couple returned was not the same land they had left. Seasons of absence, of adventure that had ended in a captured king, of drift under a regent, had loosened things. The great boroughs, which had never been fully comfortable under a ruler, had used the absence to remember what they had been used to, being self-governing communes with their own consuls and their own councils, and no love for a man in a French cloak who thought he had a right to their revenues. When her husband rode into Aix at the end of that summer and looked at his chancellor's accounts, he saw at once that the seaport had let its dues slip, and that Arles had made new laws about its market taxes without asking anyone. He was not the man to let this pass. That was clear at once. Anjou had come home from the east with what his enemies would later call an even harder edge, and it was on the boroughs that he first tried it. He wrote to the seaport that the comital mint there was to be reopened on the old terms. He wrote to Arles that the old market fees were to be paid to the ruler's collector. He wrote to Nice that his judge was to sit in the borough court once a month. The boroughs did not answer, or they answered with delays, or they answered with polite letters that meant no point in you and to see them in person. He rode out from Aix in the autumn of the 51st cold season, or 52nd, with a light company of Provençal knights and Angevin men-at-arms. He went first to the seaport. That harbour was, of them all, the boldest, and it stood by the sea, and it was rich and old. Its mole, when the comital party rode down to it in a grey autumn morning, was busy with the boats of a working harbour, the round trading galleys coming in from Genoa and Barcelona, the fishing boats, the barges bringing in stone from the coast quarries. The saltfish market on the mole was in full cry. Men in the leather aprons of the fish trade were shouting prices in the Languedoc. Cats slept on empty crates in the sun. He took his party through the market and up to the civic house. The consuls received him in their council chamber. He was polite. He was formal. He read them out the terms of his rights from a parchment his clerk had prepared. He said that these were not negotiable, and that they had been in force since the days of Ramon Berenguer, and that they would be in force now. The consuls listened. They answered that they would consult their council and would send word in 3 days. He replied that they would send word today. She was not with him on that ride. She was at Aix, having returned only weeks before, resettling her household and her little ones. But she followed the affair by letter, and she took, from the first, a part in the negotiations. He was, by his nature, a hard man in a negotiation. He drove terms hard, and he did not soften them. That was, for the boroughs, a difficult manner. She, at Aix, was consulted by the burgh emissaries when they came through her chamber on their way to see him, and she often took, quietly, the softer part in the affair. She would receive a delegation of consuls in her chamber. She would give them wine and a plate of pastries. She would let them tell her their grievances at some length. She would not promise anything, but she would say that she would speak to her husband, and she would speak to her husband. And sometimes what she said moved him a slight amount toward compromise. This was not a new thing in a marriage of that century. It was, in fact, one of the classic offices of a countess. To be the softer voice at her lord's ear, the one to whom emissaries could speak in a way that would have provoked her spouse himself. But she, being who she was, and having been raised as she had been, played the office with a certain skill. She was not a wife who was afraid of her husband, and she was not a wife who agreed with him always. When she thought a settlement he had proposed was too hard, she said so, in her own apartment, with the door closed. He listened. He did not always change his mind, but he listened. The seaport was brought back to obedience in the end, over the course of 2 seasons of negotiation and 1 short siege. Its consuls swore, on a set of relics in the local cathedral, to accept the ruler's authority in the terms of the old charters. His judge sat in the civic court. His collector took the revenues. A new charter was drawn up in both his name and hers, sealed with both their seals, and hung on parchment in the civic house. It was a Provençal document in the Provençal tongue for the citizens, and her seal was pressed onto the wax alongside her husband's. The port grumbled, but the port paid. Arles was brought back by a similar process, though less noisy. It was an older locale and understood better how to bend without breaking. Its consuls came up to Aix in the harvest of the 53rd season and settled the matter in a series of morning meetings in the audience chamber. Lord and lady sat together at the comital table. The Arlesian delegation stood before them. The old charters were read out. The new terms were written down. The lawyers' rolls, laid out on the wood, ran with the careful handwriting of the ruler's chancery. The old civic seal was pressed onto the wax at the foot of the parchment. The herald at the gate cried the settlement on a Sunday morning. Arles paid. Nice was harder, because it was further away and because it looked as much to Genoa as to Aix. But it too was brought around, in a somewhat slower and quieter negotiation, in which she played less of a part because the geography did not lend itself to embassies going through her chamber. By the middle of the 50s, the county had been settled. Her husband had established, harder than any lord of the region before him, the principle that his authority ran unbroken from the Rhone to the Var and from the Alps to the sea. The chief settlements were his and hers. The revenues came in, the judges sat in the local courts, the comital mint at the harbour produced his coin. It was the making of Anjou as a ruler, and it was a hard making, his reputation as a man of will, of coldness, of the iron fist. But it was also the making of a settled South, in which the busy places knew their standing and paid their dues, and in which a countess could ride from one end of her land to the other without being asked, in any locale, what right she had to be there. She did ride the county in those seasons. That is part of the same story. She and her husband moved through the country with their court, stopping locale by locale, staying a week here and a fortnight there, presiding over the local assizes, receiving the local lords, hearing local complaints. She was seen, she was known. The Provençal people, who had scarcely known her as a modest lass in the residence at Aix, now knew her as a mature matron in her 20s, with her spouse beside her, and with the tidy train of household and clerks and little ones. She was greeted well in the boroughs. She served as godmother to the child of an ex-merchant. She founded a small hospital at Brignoles for the care of poor women. She endowed a chapel at Tarascon in memory of her father. Her repute went out, by degrees, over the county. It was, in a strange way, a happy period. The eastern venture was behind them. The little ones were growing. The county was settled. The marriage had, by this point, moved from the formal correctness of its first years into something warmer. Not warm in the way that some marriages of the age were warm. He was not a warm man, and he would not have been if he had lived 100 seasons. But there was a habit of two people who had been through hard times together and who had come to understand each other's shapes. She knew, by then, when he wanted to be spoken to, and when he wanted quiet. He knew, by then, when his wife's counsel was a matter of feeling, and when it was a matter of calculation. They rode side by side through their county. They sat at their board together in the evenings. They wrote joint letters. Their seals went out together on their parchments. It was the settled part of her life. It would not last very long, but while it lasted, it was that the nursery at Aix in the early and middle 50s was a fuller quarter than it had been in the mother's own childhood. There were young ones aplenty in it by the time the full set was born. Blanche, the eldest, who had been a very tender lass when her mother sailed east, and who had scarcely known her when she came back, was by the middle of the decade a maid of 8 and then 9, learning her letters from a household chaplain and beginning to be taught the skills of a countess's daughter. There was, after her, a second daughter, named for her mother, who was the softer of the two, and took to the wet nurse's chair and to her mother's chamber as her sister never quite had. There was Louis, the first son, born about the same period, a boy who was, from his birth, less strong than his sisters, and whose health would be, in the 12 months to come, a constant matter of watching. There was the second son, born a while later, who was the strongest of them, and who from the earliest days had the bearing that would make him, in due course, the sovereign in his father's place. They were raised, all of them, in the way of high-born children in that century. 2 southern nurses attended the young ones through their earliest years. A resident chaplain led them through their letters. A wardrobe woman kept their gowns pressed and folded. Off the day nursery in X lay a plain schoolroom, with a low bench and a wax tablet for each child, and a slate at the wall on which the chaplain would write out the day's syllabary. In due course, a Latin instructor came for the firstborn, because she was ready for the harder lessons, and a music man of the borough visited once a week with a small harp to walk the young ones through the notes. She was in that space every day when she was in X, which was most of her hours in the middle years. She had learned, from her own dowager, the discipline of coming to it twice a day, at a set hour in the forenoon and a set hour later on, and she kept the discipline. Each early hour, she would come in after her own writing session and would sit for a while with each child in turn. The eldest at her letters, the younger girl on her lap, the elder son in his cradle, the youngest boy, when he arrived, in the wet nurse's arms. Later she came in with a book and turned pages for whichever of them was old enough to listen. She recited the stories her own dowager had once told her, tender French tales, and she chanted Provençal songs. She taught the eldest a bit of Latin when she was ready for it. The wet nurse's chair was, for all of them, the earliest proper station they had known. She engaged such helpers with care. She wanted southerners who spoke the Languedoc, so that her young one's opening words would be southern words. She wanted, also, women of good health and calm bearing, since such a helper was for a babe in arms a shelter through the delicate weeks, and she did not want to change hands part way through the opening year. She chose one from a hamlet near X, who saw the eldest through her later infancy, and then the daughter after her, and another from a farm outside a Rhone settlement, who saw the boys through their opening months. Both stayed in the household long after their milk work was done, and they were beloved of the tender ones. And they were treated by the mistress as members of the household in a real sense. Small shoes lay in a row by the door of that space. That was a custom of the household. When a babe was too tender for shoes, its rocked cradle rested in the same corner. When it began to walk, its own pair of leather shoes joined the door row. This meant that on any given day a visitor could see at a glance the ages of the set and their numbers. There would be, in those years, Blanche's larger shoes at one end, the daughter's next, then a gap where the elder boy's feet had not yet been fitted, then the youngest son's rocked cradle in the corner. The pages between the sisters ran through this period at their full flow. The eldest in the northern realm sent notes regularly, and her sheets came in the pouch of a royal messenger who rode down from Paris every few weeks. Her second sibling, across the water, penned less frequently, but at greater length when she did put quill to parchment, and her packet came in, the pouch of an English trader who took ship for the coastal port twice a season. The softest one in the Cornish residence kept a smaller and gentler hand, and sometimes fell silent for many months. She answered them all. She replied to the eldest, though the inheritance quarrel was becoming a heavier and heavier matter between them. She moved around it, telling of the young ones, and of the ordinary events of the county, and of the health of their dowager in Aix. She addressed her second sister with more freedom, because that one had never taken the inheritance so hotly. She penned tender lines to her Cornish elder, who was of the sisterhood, the one she remembered most clearly from her own childhood, the sweet one who had held her hand. The pages unfolded on her lap in her upper chamber on afternoons when she came in from the nursery. She would sit in her chair by the opening and unfold a sheet and read it slowly. And she would set it aside, and she would take out her writing tablet and draft an answer. The chamberwoman would come in with a cup of hot spiced water. The light would go off the sill. The young ones would be brought in, one by one, for the evening greeting. It was a household in those years of the ordinary contented kind, and it was hers. Not her mother's residence in which she had grown up, but her own, in her own house, with her own children and her own clerks and her own coverlets and her own packets coming in from the courts of Christendom. She and her dowager lived at that period in the same hall. The elder had, after her husband's death, kept a household of her own at Aix, in a wing of the residence, and later had moved for a spell to Forcalquier, where her dower lay. But she came back to Aix often, and by the middle of the 50s she was more often in the borough than not. She was by then a woman in her middle 50s, still in good health, still sharp of mind, still at her writing table for an hour every morning. She was much loved by the tender ones, who called her their grandmother and who ran to her quarters when they were allowed to. She would receive them there, in the space with the smell of ink and lavender, and she would let them play with a small ivory box she kept on her table. And she would send them back to the nursery at the end of a brief hour with their palms full of dried figs. She, standing at the door of her mother's quarters one afternoon and watching the older woman read to her eldest, thought suddenly that this was the same picture her own girlhood had contained. Her elder in a chair by the opening, with a book on her knee, a small lass at her side, following the words. It was a repetition, across a generation. It was the way the household of a matron passed itself on. She paused a moment longer, and she went back to her own writing. She could not have known, then, that the network of the sisterhood was at its high point. Her eldest sibling in the northern kingdom, another as consort in the island realm to the north, the softest one in her Cornish residence, she herself in her own southern county. Their notes, though not always warm, were regular. Their young ones played, in the various courts, in the shape of a widely extended cousinage. It would not hold the quarrel over their father's will, would break them into camps. But in those middle years, for a short spell, all were bound across the map, and she, at Aix, with pages from 3 of them on her lap, was for a while at the centre of it. The quarrel of the sisters is a lengthy and complicated matter, and it does not have a single day in which it began or a single day in which it ended. It grew over years out of the old will of Ramon Berenguer that had left the southern county entire to his youngest. It fed on the slow angers and the private envies that a family of that kind will produce over a decade of separated lives. And it came to a head in a series of famous meetings in the 57th and 59th years. The elder of them in the north felt the injury most sharply. She was aggrieved. She had, in her own view, done well by the line. A match in the north, a crowned brow. Sons of the Capetian blood, and she believed the settlement in Aix owed her at least a portion of the paternal domains, either for herself or for her heir. She voiced it to her spouse, to her uncles, to her clerks, to anyone within reach of her voice. She thought Beatrice's inheritance a kind of theft. She sought, in short, an accord that would give her something, or give her boy an appanage in the Ochre South, or at least acknowledge her paternal claim. Eleanor across the water carried the dispute less hotly. She was in another court, and the isle to the north lived a different life, and her Lord Henry III had troubles of his own that occupied him. But she took Margaret's part in a general way, because Margaret was her big sibling, and she was used to standing with her, and she lent Margaret's dispatches whatever weight she could when the request came. She penned her own notes to their uncles. She endorsed the Parisian appeals to the Pope. She did not press the affair herself as hard as her elder did, but she stood beside her, the Cornish one, in her English residence. Stayed out of it. She had never been ambitious. She was in poor health in those seasons and did not desire the quarrel. She penned tender notes to both sides and offered to mediate in her sweet way, though she had no real weight to bring. She was, of the four, the one who suffered from the quarrel and did not benefit from any resolution of it. The heiress refused, absolutely, to yield. That was her position from the start. Her father's will had been clear. She was Countess of the Southern County in her own right, by his express provision. And she would not divide the county, she would not give up manors, she would not settle a share on her sister's son. She was polite in her letters. She was firm in her position. She and her husband, on this, were entirely of one mind. He had married the whole of the country, and he intended to hold the whole of it. And she, whose own inheritance it was not going to weaken the county. Her father had left her. The first vast meeting was at Paris in the hot months of '57. Louis IX, King of France, was the natural mediator. He was Margaret's husband, and he was Beatrice's brother-in-law, and he was her husband's brother. He had, in the ordinary way of his life, a strong instinct for compromise and a genuine wish that his relatives should live in peace. He invited both couples to Paris. The southern pair came up from home. The elder sibling was there, of course, in her own royal chambers. The papal legate was sent for. A group of northern royal clerks was assembled. The gathering sat in a northern royal room with a long table and a set of stiff chairs. For a fortnight, she sat through this meeting in a way that must have taken a vast deal from her. She was, at this point, 23 or 24 of age. She was the last of the four siblings. She was in Paris, in her elder sibling's palace, being asked to give up part of her inheritance to a woman she had known since her nursery days, in front of clerks and the legate and her own husband and her brother-in-law, the King of France. She kept her calm. She noted, in her clear, even voice, that her father's will had been made in his right mind and had been sealed by the leading men of Provence and had been proclaimed in the audience chamber at Aix in front of his heirs and his officers. She noted that she had, from the age of 11, been Countess of Provence in her own name, and that she would not yield her name. The meeting broke down. Margaret was furious. Louis IX was disappointed. Charles was stone-faced, but content he had wanted no settlement, and no settlement was reached. Beatrice and Charles rode home to Provence in the autumn. 2 seasons on there was a second sitting, again at Paris. This one had a different flavour. The Anglo-French treaty was then under negotiation, that a pact by which the English king renounced his claims to the lost French provinces of his line in exchange for a wider arrangement, and the inheritance quarrel was folded into that larger diplomacy. Both royal couples arrived from their capitals. Beatrice and Charles came up from Aix, and so, for the first occasion in almost 2 decades, all of the siblings were in one city. These sessions on the disputed will were held in a small parlour off the vast chamber of the French royal residence. The sisters were present at some of the sittings without their husbands, and the chroniclers who knew of it later observed that these gatherings were the tenser part of the whole affair. The eldest was again the driving speaker. She addressed Beatrice at length about their sire's affection, about the family's honour, about the wounds it caused her to see her kin sitting where their sire had once sat. The English queen added a few words when the eldest paused. The Cornish one contributed very little, except once to wonder aloud, softly, whether the whole affair could not be laid down. She listened. She never wept. She answered when directly questioned. She would not give ground. The treaty rooms were cold in that autumn. The fires burned low in the French royal palace, because the palace was a vast stone building, and the fires took hours to warm any room. A north wind came in at the casements. She sat in a chair set by an opening, in her Provençal gown of dark wool, and the wind touched her cheek at intervals. And she looked past her siblings at the grey Parisian sky, and remembered Aix. She thought about her dowager's writing table. She thought about her father's audience chamber. She thought about the parchment of the will, which she had by now seen often in the Count's chancery, and about the seal of her father in dark red wax at its foot. She noted, when the meeting closed at the end of the day, that she would speak with her husband and that they would meet again in the morning. Nothing was settled. The Treaty of Paris was signed. The vast matter between France and England was resolved, but the smaller matter between the sisters, of an old will and a father's decision, was not resolved. It was left, as such matters often were, to time. The four would not meet again as a group. They had come together for a fortnight in Paris in '59, and they would drift apart again, each to her own court, and the eldest would carry her grievance for the rest of her life. Beatrice and Charles rode home to Provence. The winter route down through Burgundy and the Rhône valley was long and cold. Beatrice was quieter on that ride than she had been on any ride of her life. She was not shaken, she was not made uncertain, but she had felt, in the Paris meetings, the coldness between her and her elder sister settle into a form that would not now be dislodged. She rode into Aix in the first days of the cold season. Her dowager was waiting for her, older than she had been at the harvest, and she held the older woman a long moment in the courtyard, and she went inside. That night, in a private study, she penned a short note to her softest sibling across the water, in her own hand, saying only that she was home, and that she was well, and that she hoped the recipient was well too. It was the only note she penned that week. The offer of Sicily to Charles of Anjou did not come in a single day. It grew over 10 winters, out of a long steady struggle between the popes and the House of Hohenstaufen for the possession of the vast southern realm that lay across the sea from the coasts of the Rhénane. That being not only the island itself, but the whole southern half of the Italian peninsula, from Naples down to the toe. The realm had been in the hands of the Hohenstaufen for more than half a century, since the Emperor Henry VI had married into it. Frederick, the terrible emperor, had ruled it for most of her life. He had died in 50. His son Conrad had died a few seasons later. His grandson Conradin was a child in Germany, and meanwhile in Sicily an illegitimate son of Frederick, Manfred, had taken it by force and was ruling as king. The popes did not accept this. They regarded the realm as a papal fief and Manfred as an usurper. They wanted a champion who would take it from him. They tried first an English prince, Henry III of England's son Edmund, for whom the Pope offered the crown of Sicily. But Henry III could not raise the money and the men, and the whole affair became a disaster in English politics and helped to bring on the wide baronial troubles of the 60s. The offer was withdrawn. The Pope looked elsewhere. He looked, at last, to France. Urban IV, who was Pope in the early 60s, was a Frenchman by birth. He knew the French royal family. He knew Charles of Anjou, at least by report. He offered Charles the crown of Sicily in 53 or 54, or perhaps later in 62. The offer went through several stages, and Charles began to think about it in earnest. Urban IV died. Clement IV took his place. Clement IV was another French pope, and he pressed the offer more strongly. The letters of Clement IV to Charles of Anjou, in Provence and in France, ran through the autumn and winter of 64 and 65. Beatrice heard of the offer at first as an idea. Charles came to her private study one evening, in the winter of 64, and told her that the Pope had written to him. He did not read her the letter, he told her the substance of it. He said that the Pope was offering him the kingdom of Sicily, and that this was a weighty question, and that he did not yet know what he would answer. He asked her what she thought. She sat for a moment before she answered. This was the pattern with them. She did not answer him quickly on the vast questions, because she liked to think first. She observed at length that a crown was a fine thing, but that a war for a crown was also a fine thing, and that they would have to think about what such a war would cost. She reminded him that she had 3 siblings who were queens, and that she alone of the 4 had never worn a diadem, and that she would not pretend she had not thought about that. She added, at the last, that she would want to think more about it, and that they should not decide in a single evening. Charles nodded. He replied that he had not expected her to decide in a single evening. He remarked that they would talk again. They talked, over the next months, many times. The letters from Clement IV came in the leather satchels of papal messengers, wax bulls hanging from their cords, and the letters were read in Charles's study and then in Beatrice's, and the 2 of them, husband and wife, in the quiet after supper, would go over the terms. The Pope was offering the kingdom on generous terms. He was offering the crown, the whole realm, the right of taxation, a subsidy from the Church to help pay for the war, and the papal blessing on the whole enterprise. He asked, in return, an oath of fealty for the kingdom, the payment of certain annual dues to Rome, and the promise that the kingdom would never be joined to the empire. Charles was, from early on, inclined to accept. He was, at that time, in his mid-40s. He had been Count of Anjou for 30 winters, Count of Provence for almost 20. He had done the work of a leading feudal lord, and he had done it as well as anyone could. But he did not yet, in his own view, have a scale of his own. He was Louis IX's younger brother. He was the Count of 2 counties, beside his brothers-in-law, the kings of France and England. He was a lesser man. The crown of Sicily was a chance for a scale that would put him among the great kings of Christendom. He wanted it. He had wanted it, in the shadow of his own mind. For a long time, she understood him. She understood, in the quiet ways a wife of that age came to understand a husband, exactly where that ambition sat in him. She did not resent it. She had ambitions of her own, though quieter. She hoped, for her younger son, a realm to inherit. She hoped, for her daughters, a name that would carry them into strong marriages. She hoped, for herself. This she confessed only to her chaplain. The crown that all 3 of her siblings had worn, while she had worn only a coronet, she said yes, in the end, before Charles said yes to the Pope. She told him, in her private study in Aix on a February evening, that she was ready to go south with him for a kingdom, and that she was ready to leave the county in the hands of a lieutenant for the season of the campaign, and that she was ready to see the thing through. Charles put his hand on hers. He did not smile, in his way, but he said, in his short voice, that he had known she would say yes, and that he thanked her, The Pope's map of the Regno was laid on a table in the Count's audience chamber in Aix a few weeks later. It was a large map drawn on parchment by a Roman cartographer for the Pope, and it had been sent down to Charles as part of the papal packet. It showed the whole of the southern kingdom: Naples, Benevento, Salerno, Reggio, and across the strait, the great island of Sicily itself, with Palermo and Messina and Syracuse. It showed the papal territories above, from the Eternal City down to the border. It showed the highways that a marching army would take from the passes of the Alps through the papal territory down the valleys of the Lazio and the Campania, to Benevento, where a battle would probably be fought. She and her husband stood over the map together, in a room lit by candles on a chilled afternoon. He pointed to Rome. He pointed to Benevento. He pointed to Naples. She looked at the chart with the same measured attention her dowager had once looked at pages from her brothers. She was not a woman who would ride at the head of the army. She would ride behind, with her women, in her covered cart, but she would be there. That was the arrangement. She would be there when the crown was put on his head, and she would be there when they came into Naples, and she would be, if all went well, Queen of Sicily by the close of the season. The bare fields of the Lazio winter, as the papal messenger had described them, lay in her mind that evening. The Roman chamber, where she would first sleep in Italy, in candlelight, lay in her mind. She was 30. She had been Countess of Provence for 20 seasons. She was going to be queen. The southward march began in the autumn of 65. Charles went first, by sea. He took a light fleet down from the coast of Provence, along the western coast of Italy, into the mouth of the Tiber and up to the Eternal City. He was received by Clement IV with vast honour, though the honour was slightly hurried, because the Pope was afraid of Manfred's spies about the streets and desired the crowning done quickly. He was crowned senator there. He took up his lodgings in the Lateran Quarter. He sent word to his wife that all was in train and that she should come south with the main army as soon as the passes closed and the men could be marched. The host was a body of Provençal and French and northern Italian troops, gathered over the summer, and it moved on foot and horse down through the Alps in the last months of the 12-month. Beatrice moved with it. She rode in a covered cart with 2 of her women beside her, and she had her chaplain and her physician and a light guard, and she moved at the pace of the baggage train, which was slower than the pace of the mounted men. The march was, by the accounts of the men who did it, a hard one. The Alpine passes were open, in that season later than they usually were, because the snows had come late. But even so, the crossing of Mont Cenis, the same pass her uncle William had crossed 20 seasons before to come to her aid at Aix, was slow and cold and difficult. She rode over it in a snow that was heavier at the top than at either side, and the baggage carts had to be pulled by extra teams of mules, and the men on foot had to break the route in front with wooden shovels. She kept, in her wagon, a brazier with charcoal that a manservant refreshed for her twice a day, and she wrapped herself in furs and drank hot spiced wine from a covered cup. The world outside was white and blue and white, in the strange colours of the Alps in the cold season, and she looked out at it from her wagon opening and thought about her home in Aix, which she had left in the middle of the autumn, and which she would not see again for a good spell, and as it happened, would never see again. They came down out of the pass into Piedmont. Piedmont was in the Papal Alliance, and the towns opened for them. They rode down the Po Valley to Ferrara, and thence south through Emilia and Tuscany, and the terrain changed as they went, from the winter grey of the north to the softer olive country of central Italy. The towns of Tuscany were friendly. The Ghibelline towns, which were the emperor's party, kept their gates closed, but did not challenge them. Florence sent supplies. They came at last, in early January of 66, to the outskirts of Rome. She came into Rome on a bright, cold morning. She rode into the city through the northern gate in her cart with her women, and the wheels rattled on the old Roman paving, and the vast walls of the city rose around them. Her husband came out to meet her. He rode with a company of French knights in armour, in a manner that was already the manner of a king. He greeted her formally in the street, with all the eyes of the Roman crowd upon them, and he took her by the palm and led the wagon through the streets to the Lateran Palace, where lodgings had been prepared for her. The coronation was on the 6th of January, the feast of Epiphany. It was done in the vast church of San Pietro. The Pope was ill and did not himself preside, sending in his place a college of cardinals. But the ceremony was done in the fullness of its ritual. She and her husband were crowned together, King and Queen of Sicily, in the presence of the Roman clergy and the French embassy and the chief lords of the Papal States. She wore a gown of white silk with a mantle of deep crimson, and on her head, when the moment came, was set a circlet of gold with 3 points, on which were fixed 3 blue stones. It was not the ancestral crown of a Norman queen that lay in Naples, in Manfred's grasp, but it was, for the moment, a diadem, and it was hers. She waited at the altar of San Pietro, in the cold light of a Roman January, and she looked out over the assembled clergy, and she thought of her 3 siblings, the eldest in the northern realm, wearing the vast diadem of the Capetians, the next in the isle to the north, wearing the coronet of Henry III, the Cornish one in her western house, no longer at her best, but still a queen of a sort, and now herself, in Rome, in a circlet, in the 4th. All the daughters of Ramon Berenguer were at that Epiphany of 66, crowned women. The Roman cold season was hard. The stone rooms of the Lateran, where the royal couple was lodged, kept only a slight warmth, even with fires kept up in every corner. She sat in her private quarters, in a fur-lined mantle, and drafted her correspondence to Aix, to her Cornish sibling across the water, to her children in the south. She noted to her younger son that his father was now a king and that his own dam had a crown. She did not pen to her eldest sibling. Any note would not have been welcome and would not have been answered. The campaign began in February. Charles took his army south, out of Rome, along the old Roman highway that ran through the Alban hills and into the Ciampines, and thence into the Lazio proper. Beatrice did not go with him. She remained in Rome. Charles had told her that the way ahead was too uncertain for her, that the country between Rome and Naples was Manfred's country, and that she would follow when the way was clear. She agreed. She stayed at the Lateran. She had her household. She had her chapel. She said her prayers each morning and waited. The battle at Benevento was on the 26th of February, in the early days of Lent. Beatrice heard of it 3 days later from a messenger who rode into Rome at the gallop with the tidings. Manfred was dead. His army had been broken. His body had been found on the field in the pale light of the following morning, and had been given a common burial by Charles's men because Manfred had died excommunicate and could not be buried in a church. The path to Naples was open. She heard all of this in her private study. She thanked the messenger. She sent for her chaplain and had him say a mass of thanksgiving in her chapel that afternoon. She sat afterwards, alone, for an hour, and thought of Manfred, whom she had never met. A man of about her own age, dark of hair, red of face, a warm-mannered king of the south by all accounts. She had been an accessory, in a distant way, to a death. It was not, she believed, a sinful thought. The Pope had preached the campaign as a just war, and Manfred was an usurper, and she believed what she had been told. But she thought about it, in the honest way she had, and she said a prayer for his soul. Then she made ready to ride south. Charles had sent word that she was to come now, that the passage was clear, and that they would enter Naples together. She had her carts loaded. Her chaplain gathered his things. Her chamberwomen packed the chests. In the first week of March, in a bright southern Italian spring, with the olive groves at Benevento just beginning to come into their new leaf, Beatrice of Provence left Rome and rode south to be queen in a kingdom. Naples, in the spring of 1266, was a city in the state that all cities are in, when their king has just fallen and a new king is coming in. It was uncertain, and it was watchful. It was ready, as cities are, to make its peace with the new master, while it still remembered the old one. The Neapolitans had, for the most part, done on well under Manfred. They liked him. They did not know what to expect from a French prince who had won a battle in the olive fields and was now riding in with an army at his back. They stood along the streets on the day of the entry and watched. Charles had gone in ahead, on horseback, in his armour, with a company of French knights. Beatrice came in a little later, in her covered cart, with a light train of ladies and a set of household clerks. The cart went slowly through the streets. The Neapolitans looked at her in the narrow window of the cart, and she looked back at them. She was not, at that moment, in her royal robes. She was in a plain travelling dress. She had, in a chest in the cart, the gown and the mantle she would wear for the great entry to the palace. But she did not put them on until they came within the walls of the Norman keep. The Norman keep of Naples was the great fortress palace called the Castel Capuano, though later kings would build others. It was a square stone building of the old Norman kind, with round towers at the corners and a wide central chamber inside. It had been Manfred's chief seat when he was in Naples, and it had been redressed, in the days before Charles's entry, with the arms of Anjou hung over those of the Hohenstaufen. Beatrice, coming into the courtyard of the keep, saw the fresh cloth of the Angevin banners against the old stone, and understood that the change had already been made in the fine ways, as well as the large. She was received in the great keep by the officers her husband had already installed. She was taken up to her own apartments, which were on the upper floor of the keep, with a set of narrow openings looking east over the bay. She paused at one of those in the last hour of the afternoon, and looked out at the Bay of Naples for the first time. It was a bright blue water, and to the south, across it, rose the black volcanic slope of the mountain called Vesuvius, with a thin line of smoke going up from its top into the Italian sky. She had never seen a peak like it. She had grown up in a country of white limestone hills and grey alpine ridges, and this dark rounded cone with its bit of smoke was a foreign thing to her. She stood at the opening a full while and watched it. Her women unpacked her chests. Her chaplain went to look at the chapel of the keep. Her steward went to the kitchens to make himself known. The household began to settle itself, in the ordinary ways households do: a coverlet unfolded on a bed, a set of shoes unpacked into a corner, a bowl of dried figs set on a table by the door. Beatrice took supper alone in her upper chamber, at a table by the window, with only her chief lady for company. She was tired. She had been travelling for a fortnight and had ridden into a strange kingdom in a foreign court. She ate a little bread and a little roasted lamb and a dish of soft local cheese. She drank a cup of the local wine, which was heavier than the wines of Provence, and tasted of the volcanic soil. She went to bed early. The coronation as King and Queen of Sicily was done again, in the south, in the customary manner. There had been the crowning at Rome, which was the papal crowning, and now there was to be a second crowning in the kingdom itself, in the presence of the southern lords and the southern churchmen, so that the crown would sit with the full weight of the kingdom's own custom. This second coronation was done at Naples, in the cathedral, on a day in the spring or early summer of that season. The chroniclers give different dates. She wore, for the Neapolitan coronation, a Byzantine mantle that had belonged to the previous kings. It had been kept in the treasury of the realm, wrapped in linen in a cedar chest, and had been brought out for her. It was made of a heavy silk of deep purple, worked with gold thread in a pattern of tiny crosses and tiny lions, and it hung to the floor. It was heavy on her shoulders. The ivory throne on which she sat, in the cathedral, during the ceremony, had been made in the previous century for a Sicilian queen, and its arms were carved with tiny figures of saints. She sat on it, in her purple mantle, in a nave full of Neapolitan faces, and she felt for that opening moment, in a way she had not felt at Rome, that she was in fact queen of a real place, that these were her people, this was her cathedral. This was her ivory throne, this was her mantle. The first months in Naples went into the work of setting up the household. She had, in effect, to build a royal household from the ground up. The Neapolitans she inherited from Manfred's court could not all be trusted, though she kept many of them, because her husband desired continuity. She brought in some of her own Provençal people. She engaged fresh Italian clerks and Sicilian chaplains, and a set of Neapolitan chamberwomen, who spoke a soft local dialect she had to learn to understand. Her Latin was fluent, and that helped. And she picked up quickly the southern Italian tongue she needed for daily use. Charles was often in the field or on the way that first summer. There were still Hohenstaufen loyalists in the mountains. There were castles that had to be reduced. There were Regno lords who had to be brought in and who had to be given their new charters. He was, as he had always been, a man of endless work, and he went about his kingdom in the manner in which he had once gone about his county. He was king now, and it suited him. And he did not slacken. She ran the palace in his absence, as she had run Aix in her dowager's manor. She held her court on the days appointed. She received the Neapolitan ladies. She penned her notes. She went, once a week, out into the streets of Naples in a covered chair, with a light guard, to a church or a hospital or a small monastery, to show herself to the people and to make her own foundations. She founded a chapel to St. Louis of Marseille, her own namesaint's namesake, and endowed it with a 12-monthly gift. She penned to her dowager, in Aix, a full note in the spring, in her own palm script. She spoke of the crown being set upon her head, and of the Byzantine mantle, and of the Bay of Naples and Vesuvius, and of her new chapel. She noted that she missed her children, whom she had left behind, and that she was arranging for them to come to join her before the cold season. She added that she thought of the county every day, and that she prayed the Lord's blessing on the dowager's household, and that she was, in whatever place she found herself, always her own dam's daughter. Her mother, opening that letter in Aix, in the study with the ink and the lavender, read it slowly and read it twice and set it in the drawer, where she kept the ones that mattered most. Her Savoyard mind, which had been at work since her own girlhood, had come to this. She sat a lengthy while at her table that afternoon. Then she wrote back in the careful phrases of a woman of that century, giving thanks to God for the mercies of the family. Beatrice, in her apartment on the upper floor of the Castel Capuano, standing at her narrow window and looking out over the bay in the late light, felt the weight of the moment. She was the fourth. She was the last one crowned. She was, in her own quiet mind, at last equal. She did not know that she had only one summer of it in front of her. Nocera is a hill place of the southern realm, not far from Naples, up in the country behind the coastal plain. It sits on a set of low hills at the foot of the higher mountains, with a good air and a good water. And the kings of the south had used it for many seasons as a hot season retreat, because it was cooler than the port capital and cleaner. She was moved there in the hot months of 1267, in the way that a queen was moved when the heat of the coastal city grew bad. Her health had thinned since the earlier months of the 12-month. It had begun in the ordinary way such things begin, a tiredness in the afternoons, a want of appetite in the mornings, a low fever that came and went. Her physician had thought at the outset that it was the change of country, that she had not fully settled to the Neapolitan airs, and that a spell at Nocera would set her right. Her husband had agreed. He had ordered the hot month's household to move up, and he had gone with them for a fortnight before he had to ride away on business of the realm. She was left at Nocera with her women and her physician and her chaplain and a light guard. The infirmary she took there was a plain one on the upper floor of the royal house, with an opening that looked out over the hills. It was the kind of place a hill town in high heat offers: cool stone walls, whitewashed inside, a heavy linen sheet on the bed, a table with a jug of water on it, a wooden crucifix on the wall over the bed. She was not, at first, thought to be in danger. Her physician sent word to her husband in cautious terms, saying that the queen was improving, then holding, then again a little worse, but that no crisis was expected. The dispatches went out to Naples every third day. He sent back word. He could not come at once, because a matter of the realm held him, but he would come at the end of the month, and he was praying for her. She penned to him herself, in her own writing when she was strong enough, in strokes that grew smaller as the hot months went on. She penned to her dowager too. She penned to her children, Blanche, the younger daughter, the second boy. She did not know that her elder son had already died back home a little earlier, because word had not yet reached her. The illness deepened, the physician's dispatches changed. In early September, he sent word to her husband that the queen was very unwell, and that the fever had settled in her chest, and that he would advise the king to come to Nocera as quickly as he could. He came at once. He rode up from Naples in a hard day and a night on the way. And he came into the royal house of Nocera in the afternoon of the second day. He went at once to her bedside. She was in the bed when he came in. The apartment was quiet. Her chief lady was sitting on a low stool by the bed, sewing a square of linen for something to do with her fingers. Her chaplain was standing in the corner, saying his office. The opening was a bit ajar. She was awake. She was thin. She had been thin for weeks, but she was awake, and she saw him at the door. And she smiled. He came to the bed and sat down on the edge of it. He took her palm. It was hot with the fever. He murmured her name. She spoke his, in a soft voice. They stayed that way for a good while. There is not much in the chronicles about what passed between them, because the chroniclers were not present, and he was not a man who told his household of these things. But the ordinary custom of a marriage of many seasons standing, the way of two people who have been through a fair amount together and who are at a quiet parting, held in the space for as many minutes as she was strong enough to sit up and to speak. She died in the second half of September, in 1267. She was 33 of age. She had held the county for 22 of those years, since her father's death when she was 11. She had been Queen of Sicily for a spell of some 20 months, since the crowning at Rome on the Epiphany not long before. She had borne children, of whom 3 would live to grow up. She had been on a holy voyage east. She had seen the Eastern Sea. She had ridden into Rome on a bright cold morning and had been crowned in San Pietro. She had watched, from a narrow casement of a Norman keep, the smoke of Vesuvius. She had come, at the end, to a plain white-walled space in a hill place in high summer, and she had died there in her linen sheet, with her husband's palm on hers. Her husband bowed his head at the bed after she was gone. He did not weep in the presence of the household. He was who he had always been. He went out into the corridor and gave orders for the arrangements. The chaplain began the office of the dead at the bedside. The women of the estate came in to prepare her. Her heart, in the manner of the queens of that age, was set aside to be kept at Nocera, in a small silver casket, in the church of the settlement, so that a part of her would remain in the realm she had briefly ruled. Her body was prepared for a longer journey. Her husband gave orders that she should be carried home to Aix, to be buried in the cathedral there, in the same church where her father Ramon Berenguer had been buried more than 20 seasons before. The body was closed in a lead-lined coffin and set in a covered cart with a black pall, and it began the wearying, grinding journey north from Nocera through the Regno, up through Rome again, over the passes, down the Rhone. It went by measured stages. It was met, at each place, by the chapters of the local churches with candles and requiems. It came into Aix in the late autumn. The Cathedral of Saint-Sauveur, the same church in which she had been wed on the day of the conversion of St. Paul in 1246, received her back. The Bishop of Aix intoned the Mass. The Countess of Savoy, her dowager, an old woman now in a black gown, held the front pew. The Chancellor, Romy de Villeneuve, older still, was there. He would follow her within 2 years. The people of the settlement crowded to the doors, as they had done at her wedding, and waited in the thin light of a Provençal December, and watched her go into the tomb. A candle was set at the head of the tomb, and a candle at the foot. The bishop blessed the stone. The tomb was closed. The Countess of Savoy lived on for some years after her daughter. She survived to see her granddaughter grow up and be married. She died in the middle of the 1260s, or perhaps a little later. The chronicles differ, and was buried at Hautacom, the abbey where her own family's tombs lay. Margaret of France lived on much longer. She never let go of the inheritance quarrel, and it went into the next generation. And it shaped the politics of France and the southern county for a decade. She died in 1295 and was buried at Saint-Denis. The English queen outlived her by a few seasons and died in 1291 at Amesbury. The Cornish sister had gone before them all. She had died in 1261, softly as she had lived. Of the sisterhood of Ramon Berenguer then, Sanchia went first, and then Beatrice, and then Margaret, and then Eleanor. Those whose letters had once crossed each other on the highways of Christendom went one by one out of the world. He ruled the realm of Sicily for another 15 seasons after she died. He took a new wife, a princess of Burgundy, but he did not seem to love her as he had come, in his cold, measured way. To love his first partner, he fought a fair number of wars. He lost Sicily to a revolt in 1282, the vast uprising called the Sicilian Vespers, which cost his house the island though it kept the mainland. He died in Foggia in 1285. He was buried at Naples. The son who inherited from him was his younger namesake, the second son she had borne in the Angevin nursery at Aix in the middle of the 50s, and it was his descendants who would rule that same realm for another 100 years and who would marry into the noble houses of Europe. Her line, in that way, ran on for many generations after she was laid in the cathedral at Aix. But the story of Beatrice herself ends there, on that afternoon in the 12-month 67, with her husband's hand on hers, and the long, slow return to Aix that would come later. It ends in the ordinary way the lives of the Middle Ages ended, not with a great last word, not with a set speech to the household, but with a fever that would not turn and a hush that settled. Her life was short by measure. It was full by event. And now, if you have listened to this chronicle to its end, you have come with her from the ochre stone of Aix, at the hour of her birth to the plain, sick bed at Nocera in the closing of her life, and you have been, for a while, a guest in the halls of a Countess of Provence and a Queen of Sicily. The candles at the tomb burn low. The bishop's blessing goes into the stone. The people of Aix stand in the December light, and the December light thins, and the doors of Saint Sauveur close. And in the sacristy, at the end of that long day, an old chaplain takes the linen chrism and folds it carefully and puts it back into its box, and the vast church goes quiet, and the town outside, and the story, and the listener, and the day all go on into the night. If any of this reached you, if the chronicle carried you gently into your evening, please do consider tapping the subscribe button so that more of these medieval evenings can find you. Turning on the bell is what tells you when the next one is here, and it is what allows me to keep making them at this length. Thank you kindly for staying to the end. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.